Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. What happened that night in Marion County, Tennessee, still gives me chills when I think about it. I was only 12 years old in 1985, but the memory is burned into my mind like it happened yesterday. I know how these kinds of stories usually sound. Trust me, I was a skeptic too before that night. But what my family and I saw, it changed everything I thought I knew about what's really out there in the woods. It was late August, and we were driving back from a family reunion in Chattanooga. My Aunt Sarah was behind the wheel of her old Chevy station wagon with my grandmother Ellen in the passenger seat. I was squeezed in the back with my 4 younger cousins, Jimmy and Jack, the twins who were 8, Lisa, 6, and little Tommy, 4. The kids were getting cranky after being in the car all day, and honestly I was too. The air conditioning was barely working, and even with the windows down, the Tennessee summer heat was making everyone miserable. It must have been around 9 p.m. when Tommy started crying that he needed to use the bathroom, like really needed to go. Aunt Sarah was scanning the road ahead, but we were in the middle of nowhere, just dense forest on both sides of this narrow 2-lane road cutting through Marion County. The nearest town was still about 30 minutes away, and Tommy was getting hysterical. "Just a little longer, sweetie," Aunt Sarah kept saying. But Tommy was beyond reasoning at this point. Finally, she spotted this small turnoff, barely more than a dirt patch really, with a tiny clearing surrounded by tall pines and oak trees. I remember thinking how dark it was out there. The moon was just a sliver that night, and being away from any cities, the darkness felt thick, almost physical. Aunt Sarah pulled over, keeping the engine running and the headlights on. The beams cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of the clearing about 100 feet ahead. She turned to help Tommy out of his car seat, and that's when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. You know that feeling when you see something so out of place that your mind just kind of shorts out for a second? There, at the edge of the headlight beams, standing completely still, was something. Someone. No, it was too big to be a person. Way too big. I remember pressing my face against the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. It was just standing there, like it had been frozen in mid-step. "Aunt Sarah," I whispered, but my voice came out all squeaky and wrong. She must have heard something in my tone because she stopped fumbling with Tommy's car seat and looked up. That's when everyone else saw it too. The creature was covered in dark, shaggy hair, not like a bear's fur, but longer and kind of wavy, especially on its arms and legs. Its arms hung down almost to its knees. But it was the face that really got to me. Most of it was covered in the same dark hair, except for this area around the eyes. Those eyes, they were huge, and even from that distance, I could see they were reflecting our headlights, like a deer's eyes do at night, but wrong, different, more aware. My grandmother started praying quietly in Spanish. I remember that distinctly because she only did that when she was really scared. Lisa started crying, but it was this weird, quiet cry, like she was too afraid to make noise. The twins were absolutely silent, which was probably the only time in their lives they've ever been quiet for more than 30 seconds. The thing was just staring at us, not moving, not making a sound, just watching. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few seconds. Its head was slightly cocked to one side, like it was just as confused by us as we were by it. There was something almost human in that gesture, and that made it even more terrifying somehow. Then Aunt Sarah did something I still don't understand to this day. She flashed the headlights, just once, quickly. I guess maybe she was trying to scare it away, or maybe it was just panic. I don't know. But as soon as she did that, everything changed. The creature's whole body tensed up. I could actually see the muscles bunching under all that hair. Then it moved. Holy shit, did it move. I've seen deer bolt into the woods before, but this was different. 1 second it was there, and the next it was just gone. But not before we all saw it leap. It covered at least 15 feet in a single bound, disappearing into the tree line like it had been yanked away by some invisible force. The branches of the pine trees shook violently where it had passed through, and then nothing, just the sound of crickets and 5 terrified kids breathing too fast. Aunt Sarah stomped on the gas pedal so hard the tires spun in the dirt before catching. Tommy had completely forgotten about needing to use the bathroom. Nobody said a word for the next hour. What could we say? We'd all seen it, but none of us knew what it was. Well, we kind of knew, but nobody wanted to say it out loud. The worst part wasn't even seeing the creature. It was the way it looked at us. There was intelligence in those eyes, not animal intelligence, something else. Something that made me realize we weren't at the top of the food chain like we thought we were. That there were things out in the dark that we didn't understand, that we weren't meant to understand. I'm 51 now, and I've never gone camping since that night. I used to love hunting with my dad before that, but I haven't set foot in the woods alone since 1985. My cousins and I don't talk about it much. What's there to say? But sometimes, when we're together at family gatherings, I'll catch one of them staring off into the trees at dusk, and I know they're thinking about it too. I've read about other encounters since then, trying to make sense of what we saw. Some details match up with other stories, the height, the hair, the way it moved. But none of them mention the eyes. None of them talk about that look of intelligence, of awareness. That's what still haunts me. Not the size, not the speed, but that moment of eye contact that told me this wasn't just some undiscovered animal. This was something else entirely. My aunt passed away last year, and on her deathbed, she finally talked about that night. She told me she'd always felt guilty for stopping the car there, for flashing the lights. But maybe we were supposed to see it, she said. Maybe it was supposed to see us too. I'm still not sure what she meant by that. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, sometimes I wake up and don't believe it myself. But then I remember those eyes, that impossible movement, and I know it was real. Whatever we saw that night in Marion County was real, and sometimes, on nights when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still out there, watching other cars pull over in the darkness, studying us just like we study it. I still have family in Tennessee, but I always take the interstate when I visit. No more back roads, no more shortcuts through Marion County. Some people say I'm being paranoid, that lightning doesn't strike twice. But they weren't there. They didn't see what we saw, and they definitely didn't see those eyes. You can call me crazy, call it mass hysteria, call it whatever you want. But I know what I saw that night, and I know that somewhere out there, in the dense forests of Tennessee, there are things that defy explanation, things that remind us that we don't know nearly as much about this world as we think we do. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it's supposed to be. Story 2. My dad had taken me and my older brother Tommy hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle. That particular Saturday started like any other hunting day. We got up before dawn, loaded our gear into Dad's old Ford pickup, and headed out to our usual spot about 30 minutes from home. The morning air was crisp, and there was frost on the ground, perfect hunting weather. Dad had recently built 3 hunting stands in different locations, spaced about 2 miles apart. He was really proud of them, always talking about how we'd each have our own territory now. I was excited because this was the first time they were letting me use one by myself. Before, I'd always been paired with either Dad or Tommy. The walk to my stand took about 45 minutes. I remember feeling so grown up, carrying my own gear and my grandfather's old .30-30 Winchester. Dad had taught me everything about gun safety, and I'd proven myself responsible enough to hunt alone. Or so we thought. I spent most of the day in that stand, munching on the peanut butter sandwiches Mom had packed and occasionally taking sips from my thermos of hot chocolate. Saw a few deer, but nothing worth shooting at. As the afternoon wore on, I started getting that antsy feeling kids get when they've been sitting still too long. Around 5:30, the sun was starting to set. In Alabama, November darkness comes quick. Dad's rule was always clear: start heading back before sunset. I'd been checking my watch every few minutes, not wanting to break his trust on my first solo hunt. When I finally climbed down from the stand, the woods were already getting that weird grey-purple color they get at dusk. I wasn't worried at first. I knew these woods, and the dirt road back to our meeting spot was easy to follow. I had my flashlight, my rifle, and was feeling pretty good about myself. The temperature had dropped considerably, and my breath was making little clouds in front of my face. That's when I first noticed something was off. You know how the woods usually sound at dusk? Crickets starting up, birds settling down, maybe some rustling from small animals. Well, everything had gone dead quiet. Not gradually either. It was like someone had hit a mute button. Even the wind in the trees seemed to stop. I remember thinking maybe it was just because I was walking, but then I heard it. Footsteps that weren't mine. Not animal footsteps either. They were heavy, deliberate, and they were matching my pace from somewhere in the trees to my right. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just an echo. But when I stopped, the footsteps continued for 2 more steps before stopping too. My heart started hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. Then the smell hit me. If you've ever driven past a long dead animal on a hot day, multiply that by 10 and add something else. Something musty and wild, like wet dog mixed with rotting leaves. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I started walking faster, no longer trying to be quiet. The footsteps kept pace, getting closer to the road. I could hear branches snapping now, big ones, the kind that make that sharp crack when something heavy steps on them. I was maybe a mile from our meeting spot when it happened. About 20 yards ahead of me, something moved across the road. In the failing light, I could make out a dark shape, bigger than any bear I'd ever seen, moving on 2 legs. It wasn't running, just taking these long, smooth strides. The way it moved, it wasn't natural, too fluid for something that size. When it crossed the road, it turned its head toward me. I couldn't make out a face, but I could see the outline of its head against what little light was left in the sky. It had this massive, sloped forehead and no neck to speak of. The head just seemed to sit right on its shoulders. That's when it made this sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt, but something in between. It was deep, like it came from somewhere huge and hollow. I've never heard anything like it before or since. Pure instinct kicked in. I raised my rifle, aimed in the general direction of the shape, and pulled the trigger. Click, empty. In my panic, I'd completely forgotten I'd fired my last round earlier that day at a buck that I'd missed. The thing made that sound again, louder this time, and I just ran. I don't remember dropping my flashlight, but I must have, because suddenly I was running in almost complete darkness, stumbling and tripping over every root and hole. I could hear it moving parallel to me in the woods, keeping pace without any apparent effort. The worst part, it could have easily caught me. I know that now. It was just following, watching. Every few seconds I could hear those heavy footsteps, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always there. I ran until my lungs were on fire. Somehow, I stayed on the road, more by luck than anything else. When I finally saw the lights from our cabin through the trees, I started screaming for my dad. I could barely make any sound. I was so out of breath, but I must have been loud enough because the porch light came on, and I heard Dad and Tommy shouting back. The footsteps in the woods stopped as soon as the light came on. By the time Dad and Tommy reached me, I was doubled over, gasping for air, crying like a baby. I told them everything between sobs, probably not making much sense. Dad and Tommy went looking for my flashlight the next morning. They found it about a quarter-mile from the cabin, the lens cracked from where I'd dropped it. But that wasn't all they found. All around where my flashlight lay, there were footprints, huge ones, much bigger than my dad's size 12 boots. They were deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. The strangest part, the prints just stopped, right there in the middle of the road. Not like they veered off into the woods. They just ended, as if whatever made them had simply vanished. That was 43 years ago. I still hunt, couldn't give it up completely, but never alone, and never past about 3 p.m. I make sure I'm out of the woods long before sunset. My own kids think I'm just being overcautious, and maybe I am. But sometimes, when I'm in the woods and things get too quiet, I catch a whiff of something that takes me right back to that evening. I've read about other encounters since then, looked up everything I could find about similar incidents in Alabama. There are more stories than you'd think, especially from the 80s. Some people say it was just a bear, or my imagination playing tricks on me in the growing darkness. Maybe they're right. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and what I smelled. That thing wasn't a bear. Bears don't walk upright for that long, and they sure don't move the way this thing moved. Sometimes I lie awake at night, wondering if it's still out there in those woods, waiting for some other kid to stay out too late. I still have my grandfather's Winchester hanging above my fireplace. Sometimes I look at it and remember how that empty click echoed through the woods that evening. These days, I never go hunting without checking my ammunition. Multiple times. Some lessons you only need to learn once. Story 3. We were living in Oak Ridge, Tennessee back then. It was a nice piece of property we had, about 15 acres with dense woods surrounding most of it. There were a couple of small lakes on the land and a creek that ran through the back portion of the property. We loved it there. It was quiet, peaceful, just the kind of place we'd always dreamed of settling down in. That evening started like any other. It was early May, and the weather was just perfect, not too hot, not too cold. George and I were sitting on our front porch after dinner, something we did most evenings when the weather was nice. I remember I was working on some mending, and George was smoking his pipe, reading the evening paper. Must have been around 7:30 or so. The sun wasn't completely down yet, but the shadows were getting long. I noticed something was off before I actually saw anything. The birds had gone quiet. Now, living out in the country like we did, you get used to the constant background noise of nature, birds singing, insects buzzing, that sort of thing. When it suddenly stops, you notice. I remember looking up from my sewing and catching George's eye. He'd noticed it too. That's when we heard it, a sort of rustling sound coming from the tree line about 50 yards from our porch. At first, I thought it might be a deer. We got them sometimes coming up close to the house in the evening. But this sound was different, heavier, more deliberate. I'll never forget what happened next. There, at the edge of the woods, something moved, something big. The sun was setting behind our house, so we were looking into the shadows of the trees, but what we could see was enough to freeze us both in place. This thing was partially hidden behind a large oak tree, but I could clearly see its chest and arms. It was covered in dark, thick hair, not fur exactly, but more like very coarse human hair. The chest must have been at least 4 feet wide, and the arms, God, those arms were massive, hanging down almost to where its knees would be. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just sat there, my sewing forgotten in my lap, staring at this impossible thing. It was George who broke the silence. He let out this startled shout, not really a scream, but more like a hey kind of sound. I think he did it instinctively, like you might shout at a bear to scare it away. That's when everything happened at once. The creature, and I still don't know what else to call it, moved with shocking speed for something so large. It turned and ran back into the woods, but not before I caught a glimpse of its full height. It must have been at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. The way it moved wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It ran upright, like a man, but with these long, powerful strides that ate up the ground. As it fled, it crashed through the underbrush like a bulldozer. The sound was incredible, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and this deep, huffing sound that I could hear even over the noise of its movement. It headed straight for the creek that ran through our property, and we could track its progress by the sound of destruction it left in its wake. George jumped up from his chair, knocking over his little side table and spilling his coffee. I remember that so clearly. The coffee cup rolling across the porch, leaving a trail of liquid. Such a mundane detail in the middle of something so extraordinary. He ran to the edge of the porch and stood there, gripping the railing so hard his knuckles were white. I couldn't move. I just sat there, still clutching my sewing, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. We heard it splash through the creek, and then the sounds grew fainter as it moved deeper into the woods. Even after we couldn't hear it anymore, we stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Finally, George turned to look at me, and I'll never forget the expression on his face, a mixture of fear, disbelief, and something else, almost like awe. "Did you?" he started to say, but he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We both knew what we'd seen, even if we couldn't explain it. We went inside pretty quickly after that, locked all the doors and windows, something we rarely did out there in the country. Neither of us slept much that night. We kept hearing noises outside, though looking back, they were probably just the normal sounds of the woods that we'd never paid much attention to before. The next morning, as soon as it was light enough, George went out to look around. I didn't want him to go alone, so I went with him, though we both brought along tools, him with his axe and me with a gardening hoe, just in case. We found the trail easily enough. Whatever that thing was, it had left a path of broken branches and trampled undergrowth leading from the tree line to the creek. But what really shook us were the footprints. We found them in a muddy patch near the creek bank. They were like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. They were huge, must have been 16 inches long at least. But that wasn't the strangest part. They only had 3 toes, 3 massive toes with what looked like claw marks at the tips. The prints were deep too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. George took measurements and tried to make sketches, but his hands were shaking so bad he could barely hold the pencil. I took some photos with our old Brownie camera, but when we got them developed, they came out too blurry to make out any detail. I wish we'd thought to make plaster casts like they do nowadays, but honestly, we weren't thinking clearly at all. We spent the rest of that day in a daze. George called the local sheriff, but you could tell he didn't believe us. He came out and looked around, but by then rain had started to fall, and the footprints were already starting to wash away. He wrote it off as probably a bear, though I've seen bear tracks, and these were nothing like that. We never saw the creature again, though things were different after that. We started hearing strange noises at night, not just the usual wood sounds, but heavy footsteps sometimes, and occasionally what sounded like wood knocking on wood, like someone hitting a tree with a stick. We never felt completely comfortable sitting out on the porch after dark again. George installed more outdoor lights around the property, and we got a couple of big dogs, German shepherds. They were always restless at night, growling at the woods, but they never barked like they did at normal wildlife. It was more like they were afraid to make too much noise. We stayed in that house for another 5 years before moving closer to town. We never told many people about what happened. Who would believe us? But I know what I saw. I've read about other sightings over the years, looked at drawings and descriptions, and they all match what we encountered that evening. Some people call it Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but those names make it sound almost cartoonish. What we saw was real, and it was terrifying in its strangeness. George and I talked about it sometimes over the years, usually late at night when we couldn't sleep. We never came up with any explanation that made sense. How could something that big exist in our woods without more people seeing it? Where did it come from and where did it go? But we both knew what we saw, even if we couldn't explain it. Now that George is gone, I felt like I needed to share this story. Not for attention, or because I expect anyone to believe me. I'm past caring about that. But because it happened, it was real. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I still think about those 3-toed footprints in the mud and that massive, hair-covered figure disappearing into the Tennessee woods, taking with it my certainty about what is and isn't possible in this world. I don't know what we saw that night. I don't know if it was some unknown species or something else entirely, but I know it was real as the coffee cup that rolled across our porch, as real as the fear in George's eyes, as real as the trembling in my hands as I write this now. And maybe, just maybe, someone else out there has seen it too, and they'll know they're not crazy, just like I finally know I'm not crazy. Because whatever it was we saw that spring evening in 1950, it was very, very real. Story 4. It was mid-October 2003, around 9 p.m. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold, just a typical Louisiana fall evening. We'd driven out in my old Ford F-150, loaded up with our fishing gear and some snacks. The spot was pretty secluded, maybe 15 minutes off the main road, down this gravel path that not many people knew about. You had to know where you were going to find it. Jim was excited about night fishing, said he'd heard the catfish bite better after dark. He'd brought his own gear and everything. The moment we parked near the riverbank, he hopped right out and set up on the hood of my truck. The headlights were on, illuminating the water about 20 feet ahead of us. Sarah and I stayed in the cab, just talking and keeping him company. We could see him through the windshield, sitting there contentedly with his line in the water. The river was so calm that night. You could hear the occasional splash of fish, crickets chirping, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was peaceful. Jim had already caught 2 decent-sized catfish, and we were just enjoying the quiet night, not really thinking about anything in particular. That's when everything changed. The scream came out of nowhere. I've spent years trying to find the right words to describe it, but nothing quite captures how horrifying it was. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. Not a mountain lion, not a bear, nothing from this world. It started low and built into this terrible howl that seemed to vibrate through my chest. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it left marks. The sound came from the right side of the truck, maybe 50 yards away, where there was this massive old oak tree hanging over the water. Before we could even process what we'd heard, there was this enormous crash, like something incredibly heavy had just jumped from the tree into the river. The splash was massive, sending waves across the previously calm surface. Jim practically fell off the hood, trying to get back into the truck. I remember him yanking the passenger door open and scrambling into the back seat, his fishing pole abandoned on the ground. He was shouting something, but my eyes were fixed on the water. That's when I saw it. This thing was floating just at the edge of where my headlights hit the water. It was massive, easily 9 or 10 feet long. At first, I thought maybe it was a log that had fallen in with whatever made that sound, but then it moved. It was dark, almost black, but definitely not a log. The shape was all wrong. It was too organic, too purposeful in its movements. And then it lifted its head. The eyes are what I remember most vividly. They caught the reflection of my headlights and glowed this deep, blood-red color. Not like when you see a deer's eyes at night. This was different. These eyes had intelligence behind them. They were studying us. Sarah was crying by this point, and Jim was telling me to start the truck, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at this thing as it slowly turned in the water to face us directly. The head was huge, maybe twice the size of a human head, and shaped wrong. Too angular, too predatory. It stayed there for what felt like forever, but was probably only 30 seconds, just watching us. Then, without any splash or disturbance, it simply sank beneath the surface. The water went completely still again, like nothing had ever happened. We sat there in complete silence for maybe 5 minutes, all of us too terrified to move. Finally, Jim spoke up from the back seat. "Son, I think we should leave." His voice was shaking. I'd never heard him sound scared before, and that somehow made it worse. I started the truck, but I was terrified to turn around. The spot was narrow. I'd need to do a 3-point turn to get out. That meant at some point we'd have to face the darkness of the trees. Sarah seemed to realize this at the same time and grabbed my hand. "Just go," she whispered. "Please, just go." I've never done a faster 3-point turn in my life. When the headlights swept across the tree line, I swear I saw movement in the branches of that old oak tree, something large shifting in the darkness. None of us said anything about it. The drive home was completely silent. We left Jim's fishing pole there. None of us even thought about grabbing it. When we got back to Sarah's place, we sat in her living room until sunrise, not really talking, just processing what we'd seen. The next day, I convinced myself to go back in the daylight to get the fishing pole. Sarah and Jim refused to come. When I got there, the pole was gone. But that wasn't what made me leave immediately. It was the tracks I found in the mud by the riverbank. They were footprints, kind of like a human's but massive, easily 18 inches long. They came out of the water and led into the woods. The stride length between them was huge, maybe 6 feet apart, and they were fresh. I never went back to that spot again. Sarah and I broke up a few months later, not because of what happened, but the incident definitely changed something between us. We never really talked about it after that night. Jim moved back to Texas, and last I heard, he doesn't go fishing anymore. I've spent years trying to rationalize what we saw. I've researched every animal native to Louisiana, every possible explanation. Nothing fits. Sometimes I almost convince myself it was just our imaginations playing tricks on us, some combination of shadows and fear turning something ordinary into something impossible. But then I remember those eyes, that intelligent, calculating look, the deliberate way it moved, the absolute silence of its disappearance, and those tracks. I still live in Louisiana, but I don't go fishing at night anymore. Sometimes when I'm driving past Lake Charles and see those quiet spots along the river, I get this feeling in my gut, like something's watching, waiting. I keep telling myself it was just a one-time thing, that whatever we saw that night is long gone, but deep down, I know better. Whatever that thing was, it's still out there. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that scream echoing across the water. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, most days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that night. What we all saw. And whatever it wasn't supposed to exist in our world. I've never shared this story publicly before, and I probably won't again. But I needed to get it out somewhere, to people who might understand, to people who might have seen something similar. Because the hardest part isn't the fear or the nightmares, It's the not knowing what we saw that night, and not knowing if someday, somewhere, I might see those red eyes again. Story 5. I was 23 at the time, dating my girlfriend Sarah, not her real name. We both lived in the Glen Rose area of Texas and often went on little adventures together, just driving around and finding peaceful spots to watch the sunset or stargaze. It was something we did maybe 2 or 3 times a week, just our way of unwinding after work. On this particular evening in late October, we'd driven out to one of our favorite spots, a quiet hilltop overlooking a creek about 15 minutes outside of town. The weather was perfect, that crisp autumn air that Texas gets when summer finally releases its grip. We'd picked up some takeout from the local diner and planned to eat while watching the sunset. Nothing fancy, just burgers and fries, but it was our thing. We parked at our usual spot, this little clearing at the top of a gentle slope that gave us a great view of the surrounding area. The tree line was maybe 50 yards away, and below us you could hear the creek bubbling away. We had the windows cracked open just enough to let in that cool evening breeze and hear the sounds of nature. Crickets chirping, the occasional owl, the peaceful sounds you expect out in the country. I remember checking my watch. It was around 6:45 p.m., and the sun was just starting to set, painting the sky in these incredible oranges and purples. Sarah was telling me about her day at work, something about a difficult customer at the pharmacy where she worked. We were both relaxed, just enjoying each other's company and the peaceful evening. That's when everything changed. At first it was just a slight change in the ambient sounds. The crickets seemed to quiet down all at once, which I know now should have been our first warning sign. But you don't think about these things in the moment. You rationalize. Maybe it was getting too cold for them, I thought. Then we heard it. Heavy footsteps coming from the direction of the tree line. Not like a deer or a cow. We were used to those sounds out here. These were heavy, deliberate. The sound of something big moving through the underbrush. And there was something else. A dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the ground. Sarah noticed it too. I remember her stopping mid-sentence about her work story, her hand frozen halfway to her mouth with a French fry. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, and I just nodded, not wanting to make any noise. The footsteps were getting closer, and with each step, I could feel a slight vibration in the car. That's how heavy they were. Heavy enough to make a parked car shudder slightly. The dragging sound continued between each step. Thump, scrape, thump, scrape. Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in so hard they left marks I could still see the next day. I wanted to start the car right then, but some primitive part of my brain was screaming at me to stay still, to not draw attention to ourselves. It's funny how in moments of pure terror, your body sometimes knows what to do better than your conscious mind. The sounds kept getting closer, and I could tell whatever it was would soon be visible in our headlights, which were still off since it wasn't fully dark yet. Sarah was breathing in short, sharp gasps, trying to stay quiet but clearly panicking. I remember reaching over and squeezing her hand, trying to comfort her while my own heart was threatening to burst out of my chest. Then we heard a sound that still haunts my nightmares, a deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from something massive. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion. This was different. It was deeper, more guttural, and seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. That's when Sarah lost it. She let out a small whimper and started frantically whispering, "Start the car, please start the car." I fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them between the seats. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Just as I turned the key and the engine roared to life, the headlights illuminated something that shouldn't exist. Something that my brain still has trouble processing, even after all these years. Standing there, no more than 30 feet in front of our car, was a creature that defied everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. It was enormous, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was covered in thick, dark brown fur that looked matted and dirty in places. But it wasn't just its size that struck me. It was how human-like it was in some ways, while being completely alien in others. The creature was standing upright like a person, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, probably twice the width of a large man's. But what I remember most vividly was what it was doing. It was dragging a full-grown deer by one leg, carrying it like it weighed nothing more than a grocery bag. When our headlights hit it, the creature turned to look at us, and I saw its face. God, that face. It was simultaneously ape-like and human-like, with deep-set eyes that reflected the headlights with an eerie reddish glow. Its brow ridge was prominent, and its jaw seemed too big for its face, but there was an intelligence in those eyes that terrified me more than anything else. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few seconds, we stared at each other. The creature, the deer still dangling from its massive hand, seemed almost as surprised to see us as we were to see it. Then it did something I'll never forget. It lifted its free hand up to shield its eyes from our headlights in an eerily human gesture that made my blood run cold. Sarah was screaming now, no longer trying to be quiet. I slammed the car into reverse, but in my panic I nearly backed us into a tree. The creature took a step toward us, just one step, but it was enough. I threw the car into drive and floored it, tires spinning in the dirt before finding purchase. As we sped away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. The creature had stepped into the middle of the dirt road where we'd been parked, still holding that deer, watching us leave. It made no attempt to chase us, but somehow that was even more terrifying. Like it knew it didn't need to chase us, like it knew we were no threat. We drove straight back to town, probably breaking every speed limit. Sarah was crying, holding onto the dashboard like it was a life preserver. I was in shock, I think. My brain kept trying to rationalize what we'd seen, but there was no rational explanation. When we got back to Sarah's place, we sat in the car for a long time, neither of us wanting to be the first to get out. Finally, Sarah spoke. "We can't tell anyone about this. They'll think we're crazy." I agreed, and for 20 years, I've kept this story to myself. Sarah and I broke up a few months later, not because of what we saw, at least not directly, but the experience changed us both. We became jumpy, paranoid. We never went back to that spot, never went watching sunsets anymore. Something about knowing that such creatures exist, that they're out there in the woods, just changes how you see the world. I still live in Texas, but I moved away from Glen Rose years ago. I've done research since then, looked into other sightings in the area, and I know we're not the first people to see something like this around there. The locals have stories going back generations about something big living in the woods, something that steals livestock and leaves massive footprints. I've never gone camping since that night. I don't hike anymore, don't go hunting, don't do anything that would take me too far into the woods. Some people might call that letting fear win, but they didn't see what I saw. They didn't look into those eyes and see something that shouldn't exist looking back at them. I'm sharing this now because I recently heard about some similar sightings in the Glen Rose area, and I think people need to be careful out there. I don't know what that creature was, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. But it was real, and it was intelligent, and it was powerful enough to carry a full-grown deer like it was nothing. Sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I find myself thinking about that creature. Was it just passing through? Or does it still live in those woods? How many of them are there? How have they managed to stay hidden for so long? But mostly, I wonder about those eyes. Those terrifyingly intelligent eyes that seemed to look right through me. I know this story sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story before that night, I wouldn't have believed them. But I know what I saw, and Sarah saw it too, though we haven't spoken about it since we broke up. Some things are just too big, too impossible to process. Sometimes the world shows you something that doesn't fit into your understanding of reality, and all you can do is try to live with that knowledge. To anyone reading this who might be skeptical, I get it. I really do. But if you ever find yourself out in the woods around Glen Rose, especially as the sun is setting, pay attention to the sounds around you. If the crickets suddenly go quiet, if you hear heavy footsteps that shake the ground, if you get that feeling of being watched, get out of there. Don't wait around to see what I saw. Some mysteries are better left unexplored. Story 6. The day started like any other. The air was crisp, and there was still morning dew on the grass. I remember thinking it would be a good day to hang the laundry out to dry. Around 7:30 a.m., I headed out to feed the chickens and check on our vegetable garden. We had this decent-sized property, about 12 acres, with woods backing up to the north side. The chicken coop was maybe 50 yards from our back porch. I had just finished scattering feed for the chickens when something made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. You know that feeling when you're being watched? That's exactly what it was. At first I tried to shake it off. Living in the country, you get used to seeing all sorts of wildlife. But this felt different, wrong somehow. I turned around to scan the property, and that's when I saw it. My heart literally stopped for a second. There it was, just standing there, about 5 feet from our barbed wire fence. This thing was massive. I'm not talking about a bear standing on its hind legs. I've seen those before. This was something else entirely. The creature had to be at least 7.5 feet tall. It was just standing there, perfectly upright on 2 legs. The thing that struck me most was its color. This weird grayish-brown, like old asphalt that's been baking in the sun. Its fur was matted and tangled, hanging in these long, dirty clumps. The morning sun was behind it, creating this eerie silhouette, but I could see every detail of its fur moving in the breeze. I was frozen in place, my hands still clutching the empty feed bucket. The creature's chest was massive, easily twice as wide as my husband's, and he's not a small man. Its arms were unnaturally long, hanging down past its knees. The fingers, I remember the fingers being so long and thick. We must have stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then my brain finally caught up with what I was seeing, and I screamed. I couldn't help it. It just came out. That's when things got really terrifying. The creature responded to my scream with this sound. I've spent years trying to figure out how to describe it. It wasn't a roar like a bear, and it wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard in these woods. It was this deep, guttural bellow that seemed to come from its chest, but there was something almost human about it. It was like a cross between a man's shout and a gorilla's roar, but deeper and louder than either. I swear I could feel it in my chest, like when you're standing too close to the speakers at a concert. Then, in one fluid motion, and this is what still haunts me, it cleared our 4-foot barbed wire fence like it was nothing, just leaped right over it. No running start, no struggle, just this effortless jump that something that size shouldn't have been able to do. The grace of it was almost as terrifying as its size. I dropped the bucket and ran. I've never run so fast in my life. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, and my legs felt like jelly, but pure adrenaline kept me moving. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I just ran straight for the house, fumbling with my keys at the back door. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, I slammed the door and locked it, then ran through the house, locking every door and window. I grabbed our shotgun from the closet and sat in the living room, watching out the windows. I don't know what I expected the shotgun to do against something that size, but holding it made me feel a little less helpless. After about an hour of sitting there, my heart still racing, I realized I hadn't heard anything. No footsteps, no sounds, nothing breaking or moving around outside. The chickens had even gone back to their normal clucking. Eventually, I worked up the courage to look out the windows more carefully. Nothing. Whatever it was had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. It took me another 2 hours to get brave enough to go outside. I had to check. I had to know I wasn't crazy. I took the shotgun and walked to the fence where I'd seen it. The morning dew on the grass was disturbed with footprints, huge footprints, easily 16 inches long. They were deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. But the most convincing evidence was right there on the barbed wire. Clumps of that same greyish-brown hair caught in the barbs where it had jumped over. I collected some of the hair, put it in a Ziploc bag. I still have it somewhere in a box in our attic, though I haven't looked at it in years. I never reported it officially. Who would believe me? A few of our neighbors mentioned hearing a strange sound that morning, but nobody else saw anything. Tom came home that evening, and even though he believed I'd seen something, I could tell he was skeptical about what exactly it was. We installed security lights the next weekend, and I didn't do the morning chores alone for months after that. We never saw the creature again, though sometimes at night I'd hear that same deep sound coming from the woods, just on the edge of hearing. I know how this sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this story before it happened, I would have thought they were making it up or had seen a bear. But I know what I saw. That thing was no bear, no known animal. The way it stood, the way it moved, those eyes, they were too intelligent, too aware. Sometimes I still have nightmares about those few moments when we locked eyes, and I saw something in there that seemed to recognize me too. I've never told this story publicly before. For years I tried to convince myself it was just a bear, or my mind playing tricks on me, but I know what I saw. The strange thing is, after all these years, I'm not even sure I want to know what it was. Some things are better left unexplained. Story 7. The company put me up in this small cabin about 4 miles outside of town. It was nothing fancy, just a bedroom, bathroom, kitchenette, and a living room with some worn-out furniture. The kind of place you'd expect for temporary worker housing. But it was private, which was exactly what I needed after everything that had happened with Sarah. The first couple of days were actually peaceful. I'd spend my mornings checking and double-checking my gear, reading through the safety manuals, and getting my paperwork in order. The quiet was good for me. No lawyers, no arguing over who gets what, no pitying looks from friends. Just me and the Alaskan wilderness. That third night changed everything. I remember it was unusually cold for September, probably in the low 40s. I was having trouble sleeping. Combination of the divorce stress and anxiety about the upcoming job, I guess. Around 11:30 p.m., I decided to have a smoke on the small covered porch. The cabin had these motion sensor lights that would click on if anything moved in the yard. They were pretty sensitive, would even pick up bigger birds sometimes. I'd been out there maybe 10 minutes, just watching my breath in the cold air and listening to the wind in the trees when I heard something that made my skin crawl. It was this weird shuffling sound coming from the tree line, maybe 50 feet from the cabin. At first, I thought it might be a moose. They're common enough up there. But this sounded different, more deliberate, like something trying to move quietly, but not quite managing it. The motion lights suddenly flooded the yard, and I swear my heart stopped. Standing there, partially illuminated at the edge of the trees, was something I still can't fully explain. It was massive, had to be at least 12 feet tall. Its body was covered in this thick, matted fur, mostly grey but with these patches of dirty white, especially around what I guess was its chest. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. It was standing completely upright, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The cigarette fell from my hand, but I barely noticed. The creature's head turned toward me, and I saw its eyes catch the light. They reflected back this dull, reddish color, like a cat's eyes, but bigger, much bigger. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it moved. God, the way it moved. Despite its size, it covered the distance to the porch in 3 or 4 huge strides. I finally broke out of my freeze and scrambled for the door, fumbling with the handle in panic. I could smell it. This overwhelming, musty, wet dog smell mixed with something else, something rotten. I managed to get inside and slammed the door, but I wasn't fast enough with the lock. The thing hit the door with such force that it splintered around the frame, swinging inward and catching me in the shoulder. I stumbled backward into the living room, pain shooting down my arm. The creature had to duck and turn sideways to get through the doorway. The ceiling in the cabin was maybe 8 feet high, and it was hunched over, its head and shoulders scraping against it. In the indoor light, I could see it more clearly, though my mind still struggles to process what I saw. Its face was almost human-like in structure, but wider, with a pronounced brow ridge and a flattened nose. The eyes were deep-set and dark, showing intelligence that terrified me even more than its size. It let out this sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream. It was deeper than any animal I've ever heard, but with this almost human-like quality that made it so much worse. The windows rattled. I could feel it in my chest. I ran for the bedroom, slamming the door and pushing my dresser against it. The creature was destroying the living room. I could hear furniture being thrown, glass breaking, the walls shaking. The whole cabin seemed to creak and groan under its movement. Then, suddenly, everything went quiet. The silence was almost worse than the chaos. I stood there in the dark bedroom, pressing myself against the wall, straining to hear anything. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't move, couldn't move. Finally, I heard heavy footsteps moving away from the cabin, then that same shuffling sound, heading back toward the trees. The motion lights clicked on one more time, then off, but I still didn't move until I saw the first light of dawn through my window. When I finally got the courage to leave the bedroom, the living room was destroyed. The couch was overturned and torn apart, stuffing everywhere. The small TV was smashed. There were deep gouges in the walls and ceiling. The front door was hanging off its hinges. But the worst part was the smell, that awful, distinctive odor that lingered for days. I reported it to the local police, of course. They came out and took pictures, wrote everything down. I could tell they didn't believe me, thought I'd either gone crazy or trashed the place myself. The company wasn't happy about the damage, but they moved me to a motel in town for the remaining days before the boat sailed. Later, I heard stories from locals about similar sightings in the area going back decades. Some called it the Seward Sasquatch. Others just shook their heads and changed the subject. A few old-timers told me I was lucky. They knew people who'd had closer encounters and hadn't survived to tell about it. I ended up staying on that fishing boat for 2 years straight, only coming ashore in populated ports. I couldn't handle the idea of being alone in the wilderness again. Even now, 50 years later, living in suburban Oregon, I can't stand being outside after dark. The motion lights on my house are the best money can buy, and I've got cameras covering every angle. Some nights when I can't sleep, I still smell that musty, rotting odor. I hear that inhuman sound that was almost a scream. And I remember those eyes, reflecting red in the Alaska night, staring at me with an intelligence that shouldn't exist in something that big, something that wild. I know how this story sounds. Hell, I wouldn't believe it if someone else told it to me. but every word is true. Whatever I saw that night in Seward was real. It was there. And sometimes on very dark nights, I wonder if it's still out there, lurking at the edge of the tree line, watching with those terrible eyes. I've never gone back to Alaska, never gone camping or hiking again. My kids think I'm just a paranoid old man with my security systems and my refusal to visit them when they move to rural areas. Maybe I am. But they weren't there that night. They didn't see what I saw. They didn't feel the raw power and intelligence of that creature. They didn't experience the way it casually destroyed everything around it, like a kid knocking down building blocks. That night changed me fundamentally. It showed me that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that shouldn't exist but do. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind moves through the trees just right, I wonder if it's looking for me. If someday those motion lights will click on, and I'll see that massive silhouette again, those red reflecting eyes staring back at me through the darkness. Story 8. It was early October, and the weather was perfect for camping, crisp but not too cold. We'd set up our campsite about 2 miles from the nearest access road, in a small clearing surrounded by towering white pines and hemlocks. The boys were in high spirits, joking around as they helped gather firewood and set up the tents. As night fell, we got a good campfire going and started roasting hot dogs and marshmallows. Around 9:30 p.m., while we were sitting around the fire telling stories, I noticed something odd. The usual forest sounds, the crickets, the occasional owl, just stopped. It was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole forest. The boys were still chatting, but I held up my hand for silence. That's when we heard it. It started as a low, guttural sound, unlike anything I'd heard in my 15 years of outdoor experience. Not a wolf, not a bear. This was different. It was deeper, more resonant, almost like it was coming from something with a massive chest cavity. The sound echoed through the trees, making it hard to pinpoint the direction. I could see the fear creeping into the boys' faces as they huddled closer to the fire. I tried to stay calm, telling them it was probably just some animal in the distance, but I didn't believe it myself. The unearthly howls continued, getting closer. They seemed to be coming from multiple directions now, as if whatever was making them was circling our campsite. Then came the movement in the trees. At first I thought it was just branches swaying in the wind, but there was no wind that night. The air was dead still. That's when I saw it. Something massive moving through the canopy above us, about 30 feet up. The firelight barely reached that high, but what I could see made my blood run cold. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, moving with an unnatural agility through the branches. Its arms were impossibly long, covered in matted reddish-brown fur that had leaves and mud tangled in it. But what really got me were the eyes. They caught the firelight and reflected it back. 2 amber orbs studying us with an intelligence that seemed almost human, but not quite. There was something ancient and wild in that gaze that made every primitive instinct in my body scream, danger. The boys saw it too. One of them, Tommy, started hyperventilating. Another, Mike, just froze completely, his marshmallow stick dropping from his trembling hands into the fire. I wanted to run, but I knew I had to keep it together for the kids. Everyone slowly moved toward the tents, I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. No sudden movements. That's when it happened. The creature shifted its weight, and the branch it was on, a branch thicker than my torso, cracked like a gunshot in the silence. The boys scattered, bolting for their tents in blind panic. The creature dropped down to a lower branch with shocking speed, landing with such force that I felt the impact through the ground. I could see it clearly now in the firelight. Its face was, I still have trouble describing it, like a cross between a gorilla and a human, but wrong somehow. The proportions were off. Its jaw was too wide, its nose too flat, and its brow ridge was massive. But those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was something in them that seemed to be studying us, analyzing our reaction. The creature let out another howl, so loud at this close range that I could feel it in my chest cavity. The boys were screaming from their tents now. I stood there, paralyzed, as it gripped the tree trunk with those massive hands. Its fingers, they were too long, with thick, dirty nails that dug into the bark like hooks. I finally snapped out of it and backed away toward my tent, never taking my eyes off the thing. It watched me the whole time, its head tracking my movement with an almost mechanical precision. Once I was in my tent, I could hear it moving around the campsite. The heavy footsteps circled us for what felt like hours, occasionally punctuated by those bone-chilling howls. None of us slept that night. We huddled in our tents, listening to it move around, breaking branches and making those awful sounds. Sometimes it would come right up to the tents, so close I could hear it breathing, deep and raspy. The boys were crying quietly in their tents, and I just kept whispering reassurances while gripping my flashlight like a weapon, knowing it would be useless if that thing decided to come in. Around 4 a.m., just before dawn, the sounds started getting more distant. By the time the sun came up, whatever it was had gone. We broke camp in record time, not even bothering to eat breakfast. The hike back to the cars was tense. Every snapping twig made us jump. When we got back to civilization, I debated whether to report it. Who would believe us? What would I even say? I had 6 traumatized boys and no proof. The parents already thought I was crazy when their kids came home talking about a monster in the trees. Most people assumed we'd seen a bear and let our imaginations run wild. But I know what I saw. Those eyes still haunt my dreams sometimes. I've never taken another group camping in those woods, and as far as I know, neither have any of those boys gone camping again. Whatever's out there in the forests of New Hampshire, it's not something that's supposed to exist. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear those howls in my dreams, and I wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those intelligent amber eyes watching us from the darkness. Story 9. That morning started like any other. We met up around 7 a.m. at my place, grabbed our mesh bags, and headed out to our usual spot. The weather was perfect, sunny, around 65 degrees with a light breeze. We'd been having success that season, finding plenty of morels along the creek beds and near old elm trees. We'd been searching for about 2 hours when things started feeling different. You know that feeling when the air gets heavy before a storm. It was like that, but worse. The birds suddenly went quiet. I remember checking my watch. It was 9:17 a.m. Within minutes, the sky turned this weird greenish-black color. I've lived in Indiana my whole life and seen plenty of storms, but this was different. The darkness came on way too fast. Mike suggested we head back, but we'd wandered pretty far into the woods, maybe 3 or 4 miles from where we'd parked. That's when the first scream hit. I say scream, but it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was this horrible mix between a woman's scream and an elk bugle, but deeper and more powerful. It echoed through the trees, making it impossible to tell where it came from. We froze. Mike grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises. Before we could even process what we'd heard, another scream answered from a different direction, then another, and another. They were all around us. The wind picked up, and the temperature dropped at least 15 degrees in minutes. We could hear branches snapping in the distance, getting closer. That's when I noticed the smell, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat, but stronger than anything you can imagine. It made my eyes water. I whispered to Mike that we needed to move, but he was just standing there, staring past me, his face completely white. I turned around, and that's when I saw it. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive oak tree, was something that shouldn't exist. It was huge, easily 10 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, matted black fur, but what hit me hardest was its face. It looked almost human, but wrong. The eyes were set too far apart, and they reflected the darkness like a cat's eyes. The nose was flat and wide, more ape-like than human. The creature stepped out from behind the tree, and I felt my entire body go cold. Its shoulders must have been 4 feet wide. It moved with this terrible grace that seemed impossible for something so big. That's when it noticed us. The thing's head snapped in our direction, and it let out another one of those screams, so loud it felt like my eardrums would burst. It started moving toward us, not running, but taking these huge, purposeful strides. Each step covered more ground than I could in 3. I'd love to say we had some kind of plan, or that we acted brave, but that would be a lie. Pure instinct took over. We ran. We just ran as fast as we could in the opposite direction. The thunder started then, huge booms that shook the ground. Rain began pouring down in sheets, making the forest floor slick with mud. I could hear it behind us, the sound of trees being pushed aside, branches snapping, that horrible smell getting stronger. Mike was ahead of me. I remember him screaming something, but I couldn't hear him over the storm and my own pounding heartbeat. We came to a steep ravine, maybe a 15-foot drop to the creek below. Mike didn't hesitate. He jumped. I followed right after him. The landing knocked the wind out of me, but the freezing water shocked me back to my senses. We scrambled up the other side, slipping in the mud, grabbing at roots and branches to pull ourselves up. That's when I made the mistake of looking back. The creature was standing at the top of the ravine we'd just jumped down. Even through the rain, I could see its chest heaving. It was just watching us. Then it did something that still haunts me. It smiled. Not a friendly smile, but this knowing expression that showed too many teeth. It let out one final scream that seemed to shake the entire forest, then turned and disappeared into the trees. The storm started calming down almost immediately, like someone flipping a switch. Mike and I didn't stop running until we reached his truck. We were covered in mud, bleeding from dozens of scratches, and completely terrified. The drive home was silent. What could we even say? We tried reporting it to the local ranger station, but you can imagine how that went. They blamed it on bears, even though there hadn't been bears in that area for decades. We knew what we saw. That was 21 years ago, and I still get nightmares about that smile. Mike and I still go mushroom hunting. We're too stubborn to give it up completely, but never alone, and never in that part of the forest. We always carry GPS devices now, and we leave at the first sign of bad weather. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this before it happened, I would have thought they were crazy or lying. But I know what I saw that day. Sometimes when there's a storm coming and the air gets heavy, I catch that smell again, just for a second. And I know it's still out there in those woods, waiting. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I wish I didn't believe it myself, but I needed to share this. Maybe someone else has seen it too. Maybe someone else knows what it was. All I know is that there are things in this world that we don't understand, and sometimes it's better to keep your distance and let them be. Story 10. It was May 2001, and I had just finished my first year teaching high school in Denver. I needed to clear my head after a rough year, so I decided to take a solo camping trip to William Creek Reservoir in Pagosa Springs. I'd been there a few times before. Beautiful spot, usually pretty quiet that time of year before the summer crowds hit. I packed my Toyota Corolla with basic camping gear, tent, sleeping bag, cooler, the usual stuff. The forecast called for some scattered thunderstorms, but nothing major. I figured I'd do some hiking, maybe catch a few trout, just decompress in nature for a few days. The first warning sign came about an hour after I set up camp. I was gathering firewood when this overwhelming smell hit me, like rotting meat mixed with wet dog and garbage. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I figured maybe there was a dead animal nearby or something, but I couldn't find the source. The smell disappeared as quickly as it came. That night, I kept hearing movement in the woods around my campsite. Not like deer or small animals. This was heavy, deliberate movement, like something big trying to be quiet, but not quite managing it. Every time I shined my flashlight toward the sounds, they would stop. I told myself it was probably just a bear or elk. The next morning, I decided to hike one of the trails leading up to higher ground. About 2 miles in, I started finding weird prints in the muddy parts of the trail. They looked almost human, but way too big, maybe 15-16 inches long. The stride length between them was massive, like 4 or 5 feet. I'm no tracker, but I know enough to know that wasn't normal. Around noon, the weather started turning. Dark clouds rolled in fast, and the temperature dropped at least 15 degrees. That's when I heard the first howl. It wasn't like a wolf or coyote. It was deeper, more guttural, almost like it had 2 tones at once. My whole body went cold. Every instinct was screaming at me to run. I started heading back to camp, trying to keep calm. The howls kept coming, sometimes from my left, sometimes from my right. Whatever it was paralleling my movement. I'd stop. It would stop. I'd walk faster. I'd hear the crashing through the woods speed up too. That rotten smell kept hitting me in waves. About half a mile from my campsite, I heard a sound that still haunts me. This deep, rumbling growl, closer than any of the other sounds had been. I broke into a run. I could hear something massive moving through the trees beside me, matching my pace. Branches were snapping like twigs. I made it back to my tent just as the rain started. Thunder was cracking overhead, and the wind was picking up fast. I grabbed my phone, no signal of course. I had my hunting knife, but fat lot of good that would do against whatever was out there. The next few hours were pure psychological torture. That thing circled my campsite, staying just inside the tree line where I couldn't get a clear look at it. Sometimes it would go quiet for 20-30 minutes, and I'd start to think maybe it had left. Then that god-awful smell would roll in again, and I'd hear heavy breathing or wood-knocking sounds from a different direction. During one particularly bright lightning flash, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There was a shadow cast against my tent wall, massive, at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a bulky frame. It was standing upright, swaying slightly. I heard what sounded like sniffing, loud and deliberate, like it was trying to catch my scent. The storm was getting worse, and I knew I couldn't stay in that tent. It was like being in a nylon body bag. If that thing decided to come for me, I'd be trapped. During a particularly loud thunderclap, I heard wood splintering nearby, like something had torn down a small tree. That was it. I grabbed my car keys and knife, unzipped the tent and ran. I didn't look back, didn't grab anything else. The rain was coming down in sheets, but I could hear it pursuing me. The footfalls were heavy enough to feel through the ground. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, and I kept slipping in the mud, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I made it to my car, fumbled with the keys, and somehow got inside. As I was starting the engine, the whole car shook violently, like something had slammed into the back of it. I floored it out of there, wheels spinning in the mud before finally catching. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of something massive and dark moving at the edge of my headlight's reach. Then the rain obscured everything. I drove straight to the ranger station, probably breaking every speed limit. The rangers could tell I was seriously shaken up. They took my report, but I could see they didn't really believe me. They sent a team to check out my campsite the next morning. Here's the creepiest part. When they got there, they found my tent shredded to pieces. Not torn down or blown over by the storm, literally ripped apart. There were those same huge footprints all around the campsite. but the rain had made them less distinct. They retrieved some of my gear, but a lot of it was scattered through the woods. But the thing that really messes with me, my North Face jacket, which I'd left in the tent, was found hanging from my car's radio antenna. Not just draped over it, carefully threaded through the sleeves so it hung there like someone had deliberately displayed it, and it reeked of that same rotting smell. I never went back to get the rest of my stuff. Ended up moving to Chicago a few months later, partly because I couldn't handle being near the mountains anymore. I've tried to rationalize it over the years. Maybe it was a bear, maybe I was just stressed and imagined things worse than they were. But deep down, I know what I experienced. That smell, those sounds, the way it moved and thought. That was no animal, at least no normal one. Something intelligent was hunting me that night. Something that wanted me to know it could have gotten me if it wanted to. That jacket on my antenna wasn't just a coincidence. It was a message. I still camp occasionally, but never alone, and never in remote areas. Some people have suggested it might have been a Bigfoot, and honestly, that's the closest explanation I can come up with, even though it sounds crazy. Whatever it was, it changed how I see the wilderness forever. The rangers later told me there had been other reports from that area, hikers hearing strange calls, finding massive footprints, experiencing that same distinctive smell. But as far as I know, no one else had quite as close an encounter as I did. Maybe I was just unlucky, or maybe I was being tested. I'll never know for sure. I've never told this story publicly before. For years, I was worried people would think I was crazy or making it up for attention, but I know what I experienced. That night at William Creek Reservoir was real, and sometimes I wonder if that thing is still out there, testing other unsuspecting campers the same way it tested me. Story 11. We were living in Richfield, Utah at the time, and being the outdoor enthusiasts we were, we spent most of our weekends exploring the San Rafael Swell area. The geological formations there are absolutely incredible, a maze of canyons, caves, and rock formations that seem to go on forever. We'd been caving there dozens of times before, always with our faithful companion Zaid, our 3-year-old chocolate lab who loved adventures as much as we did. That particular Saturday in late October started like any other caving trip. We got up early, packed our gear, helmets, headlamps, ropes, first aid kit, the usual stuff, and headed out with Zaid bouncing excitedly in the back seat. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, with that crisp fall air that makes you feel alive. We arrived at our usual parking spot around 8 a.m. and hiked about 2 miles to a cave system we'd been wanting to explore. We'd heard about some interesting formations deeper inside from other cavers, but hadn't had the chance to check them out ourselves. Looking back, I wish we'd stuck to the more familiar areas. The first hour or so was completely normal. We made our way through the initial chambers, taking photos and marking our route as we went deeper. Zaid was having a blast, as usual, sniffing everything and wagging her tail. She was well trained for cave exploration and always stayed close to us. It was when we reached a new section, about 200 feet into the cave system, that things started to get weird. The passage narrowed significantly, and we could hear water echoing from somewhere ahead. The sound was different from anything we'd encountered before in these caves, deeper, more resonant. Sarah wanted to turn back, but I convinced her to press on just a little further. That decision still haunts me. We squeezed through a tight passage that opened into a larger chamber. Our headlamps revealed gorgeous flowstone formations and a series of small pools. The chamber had multiple levels, with a narrow ledge running along one wall about 15 feet above the main floor. We decided to explore the upper level first, keeping Zaid close. That's when everything went wrong. Zaid was slightly ahead of us on the ledge when she suddenly stopped and started growling, something she never did. Before we could grab her, she lunged forward at something we couldn't see and lost her footing. In slow motion, I watched her slip through a crack in the ledge. We heard a splash and her terrified yelping echoing from below. Sarah and I scrambled to the crack, shining our lights down. There was a deep pool of water about 20 feet below, and we could see Zaid swimming in circles, panic in her eyes. The walls of the shaft were almost completely smooth. There was no way for her to climb out, and the crack was too narrow for either of us to fit through. I've never felt so helpless in my life. Our dog was down there, terrified, and we couldn't reach her. We could hear her whimpering and swimming, growing more tired by the minute. Sarah was crying, and I was frantically trying to figure out how to get down there. Our rope wouldn't fit through the crack, and we couldn't find another way down to that lower level. That's when we heard it, a splash that wasn't from Zaid. Our headlamps caught movement in the water, something large. My first thought was, oh God, there's something in there with her. But what happened next defies explanation. A massive white shape rose from the water next to Zaid. In the beam of our headlamps, I could see it was covered in thick, pale fur that seemed to shimmer with moisture. The creature, I don't know what else to call it, gently supported Zaid in the water with one enormous hand. Despite her earlier panic, Zaid wasn't struggling or trying to get away. She seemed almost calm. The creature looked up at us, and I'll never forget what I saw. Its face was mostly human-like in structure, but its eyes, they were completely black, like polished obsidian, with no whites at all. The skin around its eyes and mouth was darker than the rest of its face, creating an unsettling mask-like appearance. Water streamed down its pale fur as it reached up with its free hand, easily spanning the distance to the crack where we were peering down. With incredible gentleness, it lifted Zaid up through the crack to us. Sarah quickly pulled her to safety while I stood there, frozen, staring down at this impossible being. It was still looking up at us, and I could see intelligence in those dark eyes. But now it was the one trapped in the pool. Without thinking, and honestly, I still don't know what possessed me to do this, I called down to it. Do you need help getting out?" The creature nodded. Actually nodded, like it understood perfectly. Sarah and I looked at each other, both questioning our sanity, but we knew we couldn't leave it down there. It had saved Zaid. We owed it at least an attempt to help. We found a wider opening about 30 feet away that our rope could fit through. I secured the rope while Sarah held Zaid, who was shivering but otherwise seemed fine. When I tossed the rope down, the creature caught it with surprising dexterity. What happened next almost made me drop my end of the rope. It started climbing with the skill of an experienced caver. As it emerged from the pool, I got my first full look at it. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, with a powerful but lean build under that white fur. It moved with an unsettling grace for something so large, carefully testing each handhold as it climbed. When it reached the top, it pulled itself up with minimal effort. Water pooled around its feet as it stood to its full height, easily towering over both of us. Zaid, surprisingly, walked over and sat next to it, like they were old friends. Then it spoke. The voice was deep and resonant, like distant thunder, but clearly formed words. "Thank you for your help." The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating off the cave walls. I felt it more than heard it. Before either of us could respond, it turned and moved away with that same fluid grace, disappearing into a shadow that seemed too small to contain it. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, our headlamps pointed at the spot where it had vanished. The drive home was silent. What could we possibly say? Sarah held Zaid in the back seat the whole way, and I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something white and tall following us. We never went back to that specific cave system. We did eventually resume caving, but always in well-documented, frequently visited locations. Zaid never seemed traumatized by the experience. In fact, she seemed more confident afterward, especially around water. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that day. Maybe it was a hallucination brought on by bad air in the cave. Maybe we both experienced some kind of shared delusion. But then I look at photos from that day, stopping right before we entered that last chamber, and I see Zaid's wet fur in the final shots, even though we hadn't crossed any water yet. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that thunderous voice thanking us, and I wonder if somewhere in the depths of San Rafael Swell, that creature is still there, helping other lost souls find their way back to safety. I don't expect anyone to believe this story, but I know what we saw. Some things in this world simply defy explanation, and maybe they're better left that way. Story 12. I've never told this story outside my immediate family, but after all these years, I feel like I need to share what happened to me that night in '72. I was 34 then, living alone on my late husband's property just outside Shelbyville, Texas. Jim had passed 2 years prior, and I'd stayed on at our little farmhouse, mainly because I couldn't bear to leave the place we'd built together. The house sat on about 12 acres, backing right up to the Davy Crockett National Forest. That September night started like any other. I'd finished my shift at the diner in town around 8 p.m. and drove home in my old Chevy pickup. The air was thick with humidity. You know how it gets in East Texas. And there was no moon that night, just pitch black beyond my porch light. I remember feeling uneasy as soon as I pulled up to the house. Something felt wrong. The crickets were quiet, which wasn't normal for that time of year. My dog Max, a German shepherd who normally greeted me at the truck, was nowhere to be seen. I called out for him but got no response. That's when I noticed the smell, like wet fur and something rotting, so strong it made my stomach turn. I hurried inside, locked the door behind me, and found Max hiding under my bed, shaking like a leaf. I'd never seen him act like that before. He was a brave dog, had even fought off a wild boar that got too close to the house once. But that night, he wouldn't stop trembling or come out from under the bed. Around 11 p.m., I was getting ready for bed when I heard something on the back porch. At first, I thought it might be a bear. We'd had them around occasionally. But then I heard what sounded like footsteps, heavy ones, moving deliberately across the wooden boards. Whatever it was big, and it was walking on 2 legs. I grabbed Jim's old Winchester from above the fireplace and went to the kitchen window. What I saw there, God help me, I'll never forget it. In the dim light from my porch lamp, I saw this massive shape. It had to be at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall. It was covered in thick, grayish-brown hair, but it wasn't a bear. The way it moved was too human-like. Its arms were incredibly long, hanging almost to its knees. The creature was examining my back door, actually reaching out to touch the handle with these massive hands. I stood there frozen, watching it through the window, praying the door would hold. Then it turned its head and looked right at me. Its eyes caught the porch light. They were dark, intelligent eyes set deep in a face that looked almost human, but wasn't. Not at all. I backed away from the window, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the rifle. That's when it started making these sounds, not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was like a cross between a wolf's howl and something else, something that made my blood run cold. It would howl, then make these deep, guttural barking sounds that seemed to vibrate through the whole house. I ran to the phone and called the sheriff's office. Deputy Harrison was on duty that night. I knew him from church. He must have heard the terror in my voice because he said he'd be there in 15 minutes. Those were the longest 15 minutes of my life. The creature kept circling my house, occasionally pushing against the walls hard enough to make the windows rattle. I could hear it breathing, heavy, ragged breaths. At one point, it went back to the kitchen door and actually tried the handle. I heard the metal squeak as it turned, but thank God I'd locked it. When I finally saw headlights coming up my driveway, I nearly cried with relief. But as soon as Deputy Harrison's car appeared, the creature let out one last, terrible howl, and I heard it crashing off into the forest. The sound of breaking branches and heavy footfalls faded into the distance. Deputy Harrison found me sitting in my living room, still clutching the Winchester. He probably thought I was hysterical, but he was kind enough to look around. That's when we found the footprints. They were huge, must have been 17 inches long at least. They were deeply pressed into the soft earth around my porch, showing clear toe impressions that looked almost human, but much, much bigger. The deputy took pictures and measurements, but I could tell he was shaken. He'd been a cop for over 20 years and said he'd never seen anything like it. He stayed until dawn, and we could hear strange calls echoing from deep in the forest all night long. The next day, more officers came out to investigate. They found broken branches high up in the trees around my property. We're talking 8 to 10 feet off the ground. They also found tufts of coarse, greyish-brown hair caught on my barbed wire fence. The hair was sent off for testing, but I never heard what came of it. I didn't sleep in that house for a week after that, stayed with my sister in town instead. When I did go back, things were different. The forest that had always been my backyard now felt like a stranger. I installed better lights all around the property and got 2 more dogs, but I never felt completely safe there again. Over the years, I heard about other sightings in the area, especially after they started clearing more forest for oil and gas wells. But I never saw it again myself. Sometimes I wonder if it was really there at all, but then I remember those eyes, that terrible howl, and those massive footprints in my yard. Some nights, when the wind blows just right through the trees, I swear I can still hear those barking howls in the distance. I sold the property in '85 when the oil companies started buying up land in the area. Last I heard, most of those woods have been cleared now. Sometimes I wonder if we drove that creature out of its home, or if it's still out there somewhere, pushed deeper into the remaining forest. All I know is that what I saw that night was real, and it wasn't any bear or known animal. There are things in this world we don't understand, things that hide in the dark places of the forest. I just pray I never meet one of them again. Story 13. It was April 12th, a Friday. Sarah and I had this thing where we'd try to catch the sunset in different spots around town. That evening, we found this quiet spot near a creek off Old Brock Road. Nothing fancy, just a small gravel turnout where you could park and watch the sun go down over the trees. The weather was perfect, around 70 degrees with a light breeze. We got there around 7:15 p.m., about 30 minutes before sunset. I parked my F-150 facing west, rolled the windows down halfway to let in the fresh air. Sarah was scrolling through her phone, showing me some wedding venues she'd been looking at. Yeah, we'd been talking about taking that next step. Everything felt so normal, so peaceful. That's when things started getting weird. At first, it was just this feeling. You know that sensation when you realize something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. The birds had stopped chirping. The usual evening sounds just died. The silence was heavy, unnatural. I remember looking at Sarah and seeing her put her phone down, noticing it too. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Heavy ones. The kind that make the ground vibrate slightly. They were coming from the tree line to our left, maybe 50 yards away. I thought it might be a bear at first, though we rarely get them around here. But there was something else. This dragging sound, like something was being pulled through the underbrush. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Matt, what is that?" she whispered. I switched off the radio, which had been playing quietly. The footsteps were getting closer, more deliberate. That's when the smell hit us. This powerful, musty odor, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I was about to start the engine when we saw it emerge from the tree line. Even now, typing this, my hands are shaking. This thing was massive. I'm 6'2", and this creature would have towered over me. Had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in dark brown hair, thick and matted in some places. But it wasn't a bear. The way it moved was all wrong, bipedal like a human, but with this powerful, lumbering gait. The scariest part was its face. In the fading sunlight, I could see it clearly enough to know this wasn't someone in a costume. Its face was almost human-like, but not quite. The brow ridge was massive, protruding over deep-set eyes that reflected the dying sunlight. Its nose was wide and flat, more like a gorilla's, but its expressions were almost human. It stopped about 30 feet from our truck, just standing there, swaying slightly. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, something that seemed to be analyzing us. Sarah was frozen beside me, her nails digging into my arm so hard they left marks I'd find later. The creature tilted its head, studying us. Then it took a step forward. That's when I snapped out of my paralysis. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once before managing to start the engine. The creature didn't charge or run away. It just stood there, watching. As I threw the truck into reverse, it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite a grunt. It was deep, resonating in my chest even through the truck's metal frame. I backed out so fast, I nearly put us in the ditch. Sarah was crying quietly beside me. As we pulled away, I caught one last glimpse in my rearview mirror. The creature was still there, but now it had raised one massive arm, almost like it was waving goodbye. That detail haunts me more than anything else. The next morning, after barely sleeping, I convinced Sarah to go back with me. In daylight, everything looked different, normal, almost mundane, but the evidence was there. We found footprints, massive ones, about 18 inches long, pressed deep into the soft earth near where we'd parked. The stride length between them was huge, easily over 4 feet. Some of the undergrowth was broken and crushed, marking the path where it had emerged. I took photos of the prints with my phone, but they don't do justice to what we saw. The detail in them was incredible. You could see individual toe impressions, the arch, even what looked like dermal ridges, like fingerprints. These weren't bear tracks. I've seen plenty of those. These were something else entirely. We also found hair caught on some branches, dark brown, coarse, about 4 or 5 inches long. I collected some, thinking I'd get it tested, but honestly, I'm not sure I want to know. Some things maybe we're not meant to understand. The weirdest part. When we checked the area where the creature had been standing, we found something that still gives me goosebumps. In the dirt, it had drawn something. 3 parallel lines, perfectly straight, each about 2 feet long. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, like it was trying to communicate something. I've spent hours researching similar encounters in the area. There have been other reports dating back decades, but nothing quite like what we experienced. Sarah and I have talked about it endlessly, trying to make sense of it. She's convinced it wasn't aggressive, that if it wanted to hurt us, it could have. I'm not so sure. There was something in those eyes, not malevolence exactly, but something beyond our understanding. We haven't been back to that spot since, and we've started watching our sunsets from our back porch instead. Sometimes at night, I hear heavy footsteps in my dreams, and I wake up smelling that same musty odor. Sarah says I'm imagining it, but I'm not so sure. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, if someone had told me this a month ago, I would have thought they were crazy or making it up for attention. But I know what I saw, what we both saw. Something is out there in the woods around Weatherford, something that defies explanation. And sometimes, late at night, I catch myself wondering, is it still watching us? Did we stumble into its territory, or did it come looking for us specifically? And those 3 lines in the dirt, what was it trying to tell us? I've never posted anything like this before, and I probably never will again. But I needed to share this. Maybe someone else out there has seen it too. Maybe someone has answers. Or maybe, like me, they're just trying to make sense of something that shouldn't exist in our rational modern world. Story 14. The cabin wasn't much, just a one-room setup with a small kitchen area, a bed, and some basic furniture. But it was cheap, and being close to the docks meant I could get to work early without much hassle. I'd been living there for about 3 months when it happened, and I'd gotten used to the quiet, the constant smell of salt air, and the creaking of the old wood walls when the wind picked up. It was mid-October, and the nights were getting colder. I remember that day clearly because we'd had a particularly rough time out on the water. The catch had been poor, and the weather had turned nasty around noon. By the time we got back to port, I was exhausted and soaked to the bone. All I wanted was to get back to the cabin, warm up, and sleep. I got back around 8 p.m., fired up the old kerosene heater, and made myself some coffee and canned soup. The wind was picking up outside, making the usual noises I'd grown accustomed to, branches scraping against the roof, the occasional creak of the wooden walls. Nothing out of the ordinary. I went to bed around 10, pulling the thick wool blanket up to my chin. The temperature had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath even inside the cabin. That's when I first noticed something was off. The normal nighttime sounds, crickets, distant owl calls, had completely stopped. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just the weather. But then I heard it, heavy footsteps in the snow outside, not like a deer or even a bear. These were slow, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate slightly. Whatever it was big, really big. I lay there, completely still, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice. Then they stopped right outside my window. I could hear deep, heavy breathing, like something massive trying to catch a scent. The window was covered with an old sheet I'd hung up for privacy, but I could see a shadow through it, something tall enough that it had to bend down to look in. That's when the smell hit me. It's hard to describe, like wet dog mixed with something rotten and musky. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I wanted to get up and run, but I knew the only door was on the same wall as the window. If I tried to make a break for it, whatever was out there would see me immediately. The shadow stayed there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, without warning, it moved. I heard heavy footsteps on the cabin's small porch, and the whole structure groaned under the weight. The door handle started to turn slowly. I'd locked it, thank God. But that didn't matter. With one powerful push, the entire door frame splintered, and the door crashed inward. The cold air rushed in, and with it came the creature. Even in the dim light from my kerosene lamp, I could see it clearly. It had to duck to get through the doorway, easily over 10 feet tall. Its body was massive, covered in thick, matted fur that looked grayish-white in the weak light. The face. I still have nightmares about that face. It wasn't exactly like a gorilla or a bear. It was something else entirely. The eyes were what got me. They weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, and something else I couldn't identify. I was frozen in my bed, clutching the blanket like a child. The creature stood there, filling the doorway, its breath coming out in huge white clouds in the cold air. It looked around the cabin, and I swear it seemed more curious than aggressive. But then it took a step toward me, and that's when panic took over. I threw myself off the bed and scrambled toward the kitchen area, knocking over my coffee cup from earlier. The creature reacted to my sudden movement with surprising speed. It swept its arm across my small table, sending it flying into the wall where it shattered. My few dishes went crashing to the floor. I grabbed the first thing I could find, my fishing knife that I'd left on the counter. Looking back, It was ridiculous to think that little knife would do anything against something that size, but fear doesn't exactly make you rational. The creature moved further into the cabin, ducking to avoid the ceiling beams. It was so big that its shoulders nearly touched both walls. Every step it took made the floorboards creak alarmingly. I backed up until I hit the far wall, holding the knife out in front of me. That's when it did something I'll never forget. It reached out toward me, not aggressively, but almost carefully. Its hand was massive, with fingers nearly twice the length of mine, covered in the same thick fur as the rest of it. But before it could reach me, something outside caught its attention. Its head snapped toward the door, and it let out a sound that I still can't properly describe, somewhere between a deep growl and what almost sounded like speech, but definitely wasn't any language I'd ever heard. Then, as quickly as it had come in, it turned and left, ducking back through the doorway. I stood there, knife still raised, for at least an hour. I couldn't move. I couldn't even think straight. When I finally got the courage to look outside, all I found were footprints in the snow, massive ones, easily 2 feet long, and broken branches on some of the trees where it had passed. The next day, when I reported it to the local police, they clearly thought I was drunk or crazy. They came out to look at the cabin, saw the damage, and wrote it off as vandalism. But they couldn't explain the footprints, which had mostly melted by then, but were still visible in some places. They couldn't explain the tufts of greyish-white fur I found caught on the splintered doorframe either. I moved out of that cabin the next day, found a room in town that cost more than I could really afford, but there was no way I was staying there another night. Over the next few years, I heard other stories from guys working the fishing boats, similar encounters in the woods around Brunswick. Most people laughed them off, called them tall tales, but I knew better. I'm 78 now, and I've never seen anything like it again. Never wanted to. I still fish these waters, though now I mostly take tourists out on day trips. Sometimes when we're coming back to port and the light is getting low, I look toward those woods, and sometimes, just sometimes, I think I catch that same musky smell on the wind. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to put a name to it, though others have. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it could have easily killed me if it wanted to. Why it didn't, I'll never know. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe it was just as surprised to find me as I was to find it. But one thing's for certain. Those woods hold secrets that we might be better off not knowing. I've never been comfortable telling this story, and I probably never will be. But I figure at my age, what does it matter anymore? I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I know that somewhere out there, in the woods of Maine, there are things that we can't explain, no matter how hard we try. Story 15. I was 13 at the time, and my best friend Logan was 12. We were those typical adventurous kids who thought we were invincible. Edison was a small town where nothing ever happened, and we spent most of our free time exploring the forests around our neighborhoods. That summer, we'd heard rumors about an abandoned building deep in the woods, maybe a mile off the Sunset Trail. Looking back, I should have listened to that gut feeling telling me to stay away. It was a Saturday in late August. The weather was perfect, not too hot, with a light breeze rustling through the trees. We'd packed our backpacks with snacks, water, and those cheap flashlights from the dollar store. Logan brought her mum's old digital camera too, hoping to take some cool abandoned places photos for her blog. We found the building around 2 p.m. It was this 3-story concrete structure, probably from the 1950s or 60s, with most of its windows broken and covered in thick moss. The forest had started reclaiming it, trees growing right up against the walls, vines crawling up the sides. I remember the silence most of all. You know how forests usually have this constant background noise of birds and insects. There was none of that here, just dead silence. Logan wanted to go inside right away, but something felt off. The air felt heavier somehow, and there was this weird smell, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. But being stupid kids, we went in anyway. The first floor was what you'd expect. Old offices with papers scattered everywhere, broken furniture, graffiti on the walls. Nothing too crazy. When we got to the second floor, that's when things started feeling wrong. The temperature dropped at least 15 degrees. I remember Logan saying her camera was acting up, which was weird because she'd just put in fresh batteries that morning. The layout was different up here. Longer hallways, smaller rooms. Some of the doors were made of heavy metal instead of wood, with these weird scratches all over them. We were about halfway down the main hallway when Logan grabbed my arm. She'd seen something in one of the rooms, a flash of red light or something. I told her it was probably just sunlight reflecting off some broken glass, but even I didn't believe that. We stood there for a minute, debating whether to check it out, when we saw them. Two glowing red eyes in a window at the end of the hall. At first, they were just points of light in the darkness. Then, whatever it was, moved closer to the window, and I felt my whole body go cold. The eyes were attached to something massive, easily 8 feet tall. Its head nearly touched the ceiling, and even in the dim light, I could see dark, matted fur covering its body. But what really got me were its arms. They hung down almost to its knees, ending in huge hands with what looked like claws. For what felt like forever, we just stared at each other. Then it opened its mouth, showing this massive jaw full of teeth, and made this sound, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between. The whole building seemed to shake with it. Logan screamed, and that broke whatever spell we were under. We ran. I've never run so fast in my life. Behind us we could hear it coming, heavy footsteps and this weird breathing sound, like something between a growl and heavy panting. The stairs were a blur. I remember stumbling, scraping my knees badly, but the adrenaline was pumping so hard I barely felt it. We burst out of the building into the afternoon sunlight, but we didn't stop. Whatever that thing was, it followed us outside. We could hear trees cracking behind us as it chased us through the forest. Logan was faster than me, but she kept looking back, making sure I was still there. The thing was getting closer. I could hear its breathing, smell that weird wet dog smell getting stronger. We reached this small creek, and Logan slipped on the rocks trying to cross it. I helped her up, and that's when I got my clearest look at our pursuer. It was standing maybe 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a large pine tree. The sunlight gave me a better view of its face. It had this prominent brow ridge and a jaw that jutted out way too far to be human. Its fur was dark brown, almost black, and matted in clumps. Those red eyes were still glowing, even in broad daylight. Then something weird happened. It just stopped, stood there watching us. We scrambled up the bank on the other side of the creek and ran another quarter-mile before finally collapsing from exhaustion. When we looked back, nothing was there. We made it back to town just as it was getting dark. Both of us were covered in scratches, mud and leaves. Logan's camera was gone, dropped somewhere during our escape. Neither of us said much about what happened. What could we say? Who would believe us? Logan's family moved away a few months later. We kept in touch for a while, but eventually drifted apart. I think we both wanted to forget about that day, but I can't forget those eyes, or that sound it made, or the way it moved, too fast for something that big. I've researched similar encounters over the years. Some people say it was a Bigfoot. Others suggest something else entirely. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't want to know. What I do know is that there are things in those woods that shouldn't exist, things that defy explanation. I still live in Washington, but I moved to Seattle years ago. Sometimes I think about going back to Edison, trying to find that building again. But then I remember those eyes, that jaw, those impossibly long arms, and I stay right where I am, safely surrounded by concrete and streetlights. That day changed something in me. I used to love the outdoors, camping, hiking. Now I can't even walk on a forest trail without having a panic attack. Logan sent me an email a few years ago, saying she'd started having nightmares again about what happened. I never replied. Some things are better left in the past. But sometimes, on quiet nights when I can't sleep, I find myself wondering, is it still out there? Is it still watching from those broken windows, waiting for the next curious kids to wander too far into its territory? I hope not, but I know one thing for sure. I'm never going back to find out. Story 16 was summer of 2003, and I was part of Troop 278 in Dover, Delaware. We were doing our annual week-long camping trip in the Blackbird State Forest. There were 12 of us kids and 3 adult supervisors, Mr. Peterson, our troop leader, Mr. Martinez, and Mr. Thompson. Most of us had been camping dozens of times before, so it was nothing new. The first 2 days were completely normal, setting up camp, learning survival skills, doing merit badge activities. But on the third night, everything changed. I remember it was unusually cold for July, probably in the low 60s. We had a campfire going, and most of us were sitting around it roasting marshmallows. I was sitting between my best friend Kevin and another kid named Mike. The weird thing is, looking back, the forest had gotten really quiet. You know how usually at night you hear all sorts of creatures, crickets, owls, whatever. There was none of that. At the time, we didn't notice because we were all laughing and telling stupid ghost stories, but now I realize that should have been our first warning. I had to pee, so I grabbed my flashlight and walked about 30 yards from the campfire to where we had designated our bathroom area. While I was doing my business, I got this intense feeling of being watched. You know that feeling where the hair on the back of your neck stands up? Yeah, that. I quickly finished up and turned around, sweeping my flashlight beam through the trees. That's when I saw them, 2 reddish-orange eyes reflecting my light, about 7 feet off the ground. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just light reflecting off something, but then they blinked. I froze completely. The eyes were set in what looked like a massive head covered in this weird reddish-brown hair. It was matted and tangled, like a dog that had been living in the wild for years. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stood there, my flashlight beam shaking as my hand trembled. The creature seemed curious. It tilted its head slightly, still watching me. I could hear it breathing, these deep, heavy breaths that sounded almost human but not quite. The smell hit me next, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. Finally, I managed to step backward. That's when it moved slightly, and I got a better look at its full size. It had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably taller. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, and its arms seemed longer than they should be. The red-brown hair covered its entire body. I turned and ran back to the campfire so fast I nearly tripped 3 times. I burst into the circle of light, probably white as a sheet. Kevin immediately asked what was wrong, but I couldn't get the words out at first. When I finally managed to speak, I just pointed and said, "There's something out there." Mr. Peterson grabbed his flashlight and walked a few steps in the direction I pointed. That's when we all heard it. This deep, rumbling sound, somewhere between a growl and a hum. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It was just there. The creature stepped forward just enough that the firelight caught it. Everyone saw it this time. Some of the younger kids started crying. Mr. Thompson quickly got everyone to bunch together closer to the fire. Mr. Peterson still had his flashlight pointed at the creature, and Mr. Martinez was fumbling with the satellite phone we had for emergencies. The thing just watched us. For what felt like hours, but was probably only 15-20 minutes, it stood there, occasionally tilting its head or shifting its weight. Its eyes reflected the firelight now, giving them this eerie orange glow. The matted red-brown hair moved slightly in the breeze, and I could see muscles rippling underneath. This thing was incredibly powerful. What struck me most was how it seemed to be studying us. There was intelligence in those eyes. Not animal intelligence, something different. It seemed almost as curious about us as we were terrified of it. At one point it took a step closer to the fire, and we could all see it better. Its face was almost human-like, but not quite. The forehead was more pronounced, the jaw more massive. The nose was flatter, more ape-like. Mr. Martinez finally got through to someone on the satellite phone and was quietly explaining our situation. That seemed to interest the creature. It cocked its head toward the sound of his voice and made that humming growl noise again. Then something weird happened. One of the logs in our fire popped loudly, sending up a shower of sparks. The creature actually jumped back, almost like it was startled. That human-like reaction somehow made it even more unsettling. It backed up a few steps, still watching us, then turned and moved into the forest. The way it moved was strange, fluid and graceful despite its massive size. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, taking turns keeping watch. None of us slept. The adults had a quiet discussion and decided we'd pack up and leave at first light. Throughout the night, we could hear heavy footsteps circling our camp, always just out of sight in the darkness. Occasionally we'd catch glimpses of those eyes reflecting our firelight from different directions. When dawn finally came, we packed up in record time. As we were leaving, I noticed something that still gives me chills. There were footprints all around our camp, massive ones, easily 16 inches long. But the weird part was the pattern. They formed a perfect circle around our campsite, like the thing had been pacing around us all night, watching. That's not the end of the story, though. Fast forward to 2023. Kevin and I had stayed friends all these years, and we often talked about what we saw that night. We decided to go back. Crazy, right? We convinced Mike and 2 other guys from our old troop to come with us. We were all in our early 30s now, and we figured whatever we saw back then couldn't be as scary when we were adults. We were wrong. We set up camp in almost the exact same spot. The first day was fine. We just hung out, grilled some food, had a few beers, and talked about old times. But as night fell, that same unnatural silence descended on the forest. Kevin noticed it first and gave me this look that said he remembered. We were all sitting around the campfire when we heard it, that same humming growl from 20 years ago. My blood ran cold. It was impossible, but I knew that sound. We all did. It stepped into the firelight, and I swear it was the same creature. The same red-brown matted hair, the same massive size, the same intelligent eyes. It hadn't aged a day. It stood there, watching us just like before, head tilted in that curious way. But this time, something different happened. It slowly raised one of its massive hands, palm out, almost like it was waving. Then it made this sound, not the humming growl, but something that almost sounded like speech. Not English, not any language I know, but definitely patterned sounds. We were terrified, but also amazed. Mike actually raised his hand and waved back. The creature's eyes seemed to focus on him, and it made those speech-like sounds again. Then it did something that nearly stopped my heart. It pointed at us, then at itself, then at the ground, like it was trying to say, "You were here before." It remembered us. After 20 years, it recognized us. We stayed frozen like that for maybe 10 minutes, this bizarre standoff where we were all just looking at each other. Then, just like before, it turned and walked away into the forest. We could hear it moving around throughout the night, but it never came as close again. We left the next morning, and I haven't been back since. I've tried researching similar encounters in the area, but there isn't much. A few vague reports of a large red-haired creature in the state forest, but nothing concrete. I still don't know what we saw. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't wave or try to communicate. It wasn't a person in a suit. No costume could move that naturally or maintain that illusion up close. Whatever it was intelligent enough to remember us after 20 years, and that's perhaps the most terrifying part of all. Sometimes I think about going back again, maybe trying to communicate with it more. But then I remember those footprints circling our camp, those impossibly strong muscles under that red hair, and I decide maybe some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've never told this story publicly before. For years I thought people would think I was crazy, but I know what I saw, both as a kid and as an adult. And I know there are things in this world that we can't explain. That creature is still out there in the Blackbird State Forest. Sometimes on quiet nights, I can still hear that strange humming growl in my dreams. Story 17. I never thought I'd actually share this story, but after keeping it to myself for so long, I feel like I need to get it off my chest. This happened last summer when I went to visit my grandparents' property in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. It's been in our family for generations, and there's always been these weird stories passed down about something living in the woods near the creek, but I never really believed them. I guess I should have. My grandpa passed away last year, and my grandma's been having trouble maintaining the property by herself. Being the oldest grandchild, I volunteered to spend a few weeks helping her clear out some of the overgrowth and fix up the old fence line that runs along the creek. The property's pretty isolated, about 40 acres of mostly woodland, with this creek cutting through it. My grandparents' house sits near the front of the property, but the back portion is all dense forest. I arrived early that morning, around 6 a.m., wanting to get an early start before the Arkansas summer heat kicked in. Grandma was still asleep, so I left her a note and headed out back with my tools. The morning was misty, and there was this weird silence in the air. You know, that kind of heavy quiet where even the birds seem unusually still. I remember thinking it was strange because usually the woods would be full of morning sounds. As I made my way down to the creek, following the old dirt path, I kept getting this feeling like something was watching me. I've spent plenty of time in these woods before, but something felt different that day. The air felt heavier, almost electric, like right before a storm. But the sky was clear. I reached the section of fence that needed repair. It was about a quarter mile from the house, right where the creek bends around this cluster of old oak trees. The fence posts were rotting, and some sections had completely fallen over. I set down my tools and started taking measurements, trying to ignore this growing unease in my stomach. That's when I noticed the smell. If you've ever been around dead animals or really stagnant water, it was kind of like that, but different, more musty and wild, almost like wet dog mixed with something I can't even describe. It was strong enough to make my eyes water. I heard a splash in the creek, which wasn't unusual. There are usually deer coming to drink in the morning. But when I looked up, everything around the creek just went still. The water was moving, but there weren't any animals in sight. The mist was still hanging low over the water, making it hard to see the other bank clearly. Then I saw the footprints. They were pressed deep into the mud by the creek's edge, maybe 15 feet from where I was standing. At first, my brain tried to make sense of them as bear tracks, but they were way too big, easily 16 inches long, and shaped all wrong. They were clearly footprints with 5 distinct toes, but massive. The stride length between them was incredible, easily 6 feet apart. My hands started shaking as I took out my phone to take pictures, but before I could, I heard this sound that made my blood run cold. It was like a deep breath, but amplified, coming from the other side of the creek. The mist seemed to part slightly, and that's when I saw it. It was standing perfectly still among the trees on the other bank, partially hidden behind a thick oak trunk, but clearly visible enough that I could make out its features. The thing was huge. I'm 6'2", and this creature had to be at least 8 feet tall. It was covered in thick, grayish-brown hair that looked matted in some places. But what struck me most were its eyes. They were dark and surprisingly intelligent-looking. I couldn't move. My whole body was frozen in place as we just stared at each other. It didn't seem aggressive, but there was this overwhelming sense of territoriality in its posture, like it was saying, "You're in my space." The weirdest part was that it felt familiar somehow, like it knew who I was, or at least recognized me as belonging to the family that owned the land. Then I remembered all those stories my grandpa used to tell us, how his father had first encountered the guardian of the creek back in the 1940s, how it would sometimes watch them from the trees when they were fishing or working on the fence line, how it had never hurt anyone, but always made its presence known when people got too close to certain parts of the property. For years, I'd dismissed these as just tall tales meant to keep us kids from wandering too far into the woods. But standing there, looking at this creature, everything clicked into place. This was real. This was what my family had been seeing for generations. Suddenly, there was a loud crack from somewhere behind me, probably a branch falling. I instinctively turned toward the sound, and when I looked back, the creature was gone. But I could hear it moving through the underbrush on the other side of the creek, branches cracking under its weight as it retreated into the deeper woods. My legs finally started working again, and I backed away slowly, never turning my back to the creek. Once I felt I was at a safe distance, I practically ran back to the house. My grandmother was up by then, sitting at the kitchen table with her morning coffee. The look on my face must have told her everything, because before I could say anything, she just nodded and said, "You saw it, didn't you?" We spent the next few hours talking. She told me how my grandfather had seen it dozens of times over the years, how it seemed to have some kind of understanding with our family. We respected its territory, and it respected ours. She showed me a journal my great-grandfather had kept, documenting his encounters with the creature dating back to 1943. The thing that strikes me most, looking back, is how different this encounter was from what you typically hear in Bigfoot stories. There was no aggression, no feeling of being hunted or threatened. It was more like encountering a neighbor, albeit a very large, very unusual one, who was simply letting you know you were in their space. I ended up staying with my grandmother for the full 3 weeks as planned, but I didn't go back to that section of the creek. I did the repair work on other parts of the property, always keeping my distance from that bend in the creek. Sometimes, early in the morning or late in the evening, I'd catch that distinctive smell on the breeze or hear heavy footsteps in the woods. Once, I even saw a dark shape moving through the trees at dusk, but I never had another close encounter like that first day. What really gets me is thinking about how long this creature, or maybe its ancestors, has been living on our land. My family has owned that property since the 1920s, and the stories about the creek guardian go back almost that far. It makes me wonder how many other families have similar stories they're not sharing. I still help my grandmother maintain the property, but now I make sure to respect the unspoken boundaries. The fence by the creek bend remains unfixed, and honestly, I think that's how it should stay. Some territories aren't meant to be claimed or maintained by us. The weirdest part. Sometimes at night I can swear I hear those heavy breathing sounds, even though I'm hundreds of miles away now. It's like that encounter awakened some primal part of my brain that's now always listening for something in the woods. I've tried to convince myself that there must be some logical explanation, but deep down, I know what I saw. Our family's guardian is real, and it's still out there, watching over its territory just as it has for generations. I've never taken anyone else to that spot, and I probably never will. Some things are meant to stay within the family, I guess. But sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching from the trees, keeping its silent vigil over the creek, just like it has for all these years. And sometimes on quiet nights, I find myself hoping it is. Story 18. It happened back in '91 at Pine Grove Lake in Montana. I was 34 then, working as a mechanic in town, and fishing was my escape from the daily grind. That morning started like any other Saturday in early October. The air was crisp, and there was that smell of pine needles and damp earth that you only get in Montana during fall. I'd picked my usual spot, a quiet inlet on the eastern shore where the trout liked to gather. I remember checking my watch when I first got there, 6:45 a.m. The sun was just starting to peek through the trees, creating these long shadows across the water. I'd brought my trusty Coleman cooler with a couple of sandwiches and some beers, my tackle box, and my old Nikon binoculars. Those binoculars were probably the most valuable thing I owned at the time, a gift from my dad before he passed. The first couple of hours were normal. I caught 2 decent-sized rainbow trout, nothing spectacular but enough to make it worth getting up early. Around 9:30 I noticed something odd. You know how when you're outdoors a lot, you start picking up on things that city folks might miss? Well, the forest had this rhythm to it. Birds calling, squirrels chattering, the constant hum of insects. But suddenly, everything just stopped. At first, I thought maybe a hawk was circling overhead. That usually spooks the smaller creatures. But when I looked up, the sky was clear. That's when this weird feeling started creeping up my spine. You know that sensation when you're alone, but you suddenly feel like someone's watching you. It was like that, but 100 times stronger. The silence was so complete, it felt like someone had stuffed cotton in my ears. Even the gentle lapping of water against the shore seemed muted. My fishing line made this unnaturally loud zip sound when I reeled it in, and it actually made me jump. I remember taking a swig from my beer, trying to calm my nerves, telling myself I was being ridiculous. That's when I noticed movement on the opposite shore, maybe 200 yards away. At first I thought it was a bear. We get plenty of those around here, and I always keep bear spray handy. But something about the way it moved wasn't right. I reached for my binoculars, hands shaking slightly. What I saw through those lenses, I've replayed it in my mind countless times, questioning if what I saw was real. But I know what I saw. I know because I haven't been able to forget a single detail. This thing emerged from between 2 large pine trees, ducking under some low branches. It was huge, and I mean huge. I've seen grizzlies up close, and this thing made them look small. It had to be at least 9 feet tall. But it wasn't just the size that got to me. It was how it moved. Bears are graceful in their own way, but this thing, it moved like an athlete. Every movement was deliberate, controlled. The fur was dark, almost black, but with these reddish-brown patches visible where the sun hit it. It wasn't matted like a bear's fur. It looked almost groomed, flowing with the creature's movements. But the face, God, the face is what still haunts me. Through the binoculars I could see it clearly when it bent down to drink from the lake. It wasn't an animal's face, not really. The features were almost human, but wrong somehow. The forehead jutted out prominently, creating this heavy brow ridge over deeply set eyes. The nose was broad and flat, but definitely more human than ape-like. And the eyes, they were dark, but not like an animal's eyes. There was something behind them, intelligence, awareness. I remember my hands were shaking so bad I had to set the binoculars down. I fumbled for my disposable camera. I always kept one in my tackle box for when I caught something worth bragging about. By the time I got it out and looked up again, the creature had straightened up to its full height. That's when it happened. It turned its head, and I swear to God it looked right at me. Not in my general direction, at me. You know how you can tell when someone's really seeing you, not just looking your way? It was like that. My whole body went cold and I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it did something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. It tilted its head, just slightly, like it was studying me. Like it was curious. Not aggressive, not scared, just interested. I managed to snap one photo, but my hands were shaking so bad, and honestly, I wasn't even looking through the viewfinder properly. When I finally got the film developed weeks later, all you could see was a dark blur against the trees. I've been kicking myself ever since for not taking more pictures, but in that moment, my brain just wasn't working right. The creature stayed at the water's edge for maybe another minute, still watching me. Then, without any rush, it turned and walked back into the tree line. Its movements were so smooth, so controlled, nothing like the lumbering walk of a bear or the way gorillas move in those nature documentaries. It disappeared into the forest, like a shadow melting into darkness. The moment it was gone, it was like someone turned the volume back up. Birds started singing again, insects resumed their buzzing, and a squirrel ran down a nearby tree, chattering angrily like nothing had happened. But something had happened, something that changed how I see the world. I sat there for a long time, maybe another hour, just trying to process what I'd seen. My beer had gone warm, and my fishing line was still reeled in. When I finally got up to leave, my legs were so shaky I almost fell over. Here's the thing that really gets me. I've been back to that spot hundreds of times since then. I've spent countless hours watching that shoreline, hoping to see it again. I've looked for tracks, broken branches, anything that might prove what I saw was real. But I've never found anything conclusive, never seen anything like it again. I didn't report it officially. In a small town like Pine Grove, you learn to keep certain things to yourself unless you want to become the local crazy person. I told my wife, of course, but even she's skeptical. Says maybe it was the morning light playing tricks on me, or maybe I dozed off and dreamed it. But I know what I saw. The thing that bothers me most isn't the size of the creature, or even its eerily human-like features. It's that look it gave me. There was recognition in those eyes, not like it knew me personally, but like it recognized me as another thinking being. Sometimes I wonder if it tells stories about the strange human it saw that day. I still fish that lake, still bring my binoculars, and now a digital camera too, just in case. Every time I'm there I feel like I'm being watched, but I've never seen anything like that again. The locals sometimes talk about strange sounds in the woods or livestock acting spooked for no reason, but nobody else has ever reported seeing what I saw. I've read about other Bigfoot sightings since then, trying to make sense of what I experienced. Some stories sound similar to mine, but many seem sensationalized or outright fake. What I saw wasn't some monster or mythical beast. It was a living, breathing creature that seemed just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. These days, I'm not sure what to believe anymore. All I know is what I saw that morning changed something in me. When people talk about Bigfoot sightings now, I don't laugh or scoff like I used to. Instead, I think about that morning in '91, about those intelligent eyes studying me across the lake, and I wonder about all the things in this world we think we understand, but don't. Sometimes when I'm out fishing now, especially early in the morning when the mist is still rising off the lake, I'll hear the forest go quiet again. My heart will start racing, and I'll grab my binoculars, scanning the opposite shore. It hasn't happened again in all these years, but part of me hopes it will. Part of me needs to know it wasn't just some freak occurrence, that somewhere out there in the vast Montana wilderness, that creature is still roaming, still occasionally stopping to drink from quiet lakes in the early morning light. I don't expect anyone to believe my story. Hell, some days I barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw that morning, and I know that somewhere out there in the dense forests of Montana, there are things we haven't explained yet. Things that maybe we're not meant to explain, All I can say is that if you're ever fishing alone on a quiet morning and the forest suddenly goes silent, pay attention. You might just see something that changes your life forever. Story 19. It was early November 1977, and we were cutting firewood like we did every fall. Tom and I had this routine down since we were teenagers. Head out early, get the work done before the weather turned nasty. Oregon winters don't mess around, and we needed enough wood to last through the cold months. That morning was different, though. There was this weird heaviness in the air, like right before a storm, but the sky was clear. We'd driven our old pickup about 7 miles out on Cedar Creek Road to this spot we'd been using for years. It was maybe 7:30 a.m. when we started unloading our gear. The air was crisp, and you could see your breath, but it wasn't too cold yet. Tom was having trouble with his chainsaw, so I went to scout ahead while he fiddled with it. That's when I first noticed something was off. The birds weren't making their usual racket. Anyone who spends time in the woods knows that silence isn't natural. It makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I walked down toward the creek where we'd spotted some good fallen timber the week before. The ground was still soft from the rain we'd had, and that's when I saw them. Footprints that made my blood run cold. At first I thought I was seeing things. They were huge, easily 18 inches long, about 45 centimeters. I'd been hunting these woods since I was a kid, and I'd never seen anything like this. "Tom," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to see this." I heard him cursing at his chainsaw, then his footsteps approaching. When he saw what I was looking at, he just stood there, mouth open. The prints were deep in the mud, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. They weren't bear tracks. I've seen plenty of those. These were clearly feet, with 5 toes, but massive. "Should we follow them?" Tom asked, already knowing my answer. We'd both grown up hearing the stories about Bigfoot, but like most locals, we'd always laughed them off. Now, standing there looking at those prints, we weren't laughing anymore. The tracks led upstream, so we followed them. Every few steps we'd stop and listen. The silence was getting more oppressive. Then we noticed the trees. Young alders and birches snapped off like twigs, but at least 8 feet up. No bear could do that. No human either. That's when the smell hit us. If you've ever been around a wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something musky, that's close, but not quite right. It was distinctive and got stronger as we went along. My stomach was doing flips, but curiosity kept pushing us forward. We'd gone maybe a 1/4 mile when Tom grabbed my arm. "Listen," he whispered. At first, I didn't hear anything. Then it came. This deep, rumbling sound that wasn't quite a growl, but wasn't quite human either. It seemed to come from above us. Slowly, we both looked up into the trees. The Douglas firs were thick there, branches interweaving overhead. That's when I saw movement. Not just branches swaying in the wind, but deliberate movement. Something big was up there, moving between the trees with an agility that seemed impossible for its size. Through gaps in the branches, I caught glimpses of reddish-brown fur. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more. But what really got me were its movements. They were smooth, calculated, intelligent. This wasn't some dumb animal crashing through the forest. Then it stopped. Through a break in the branches, I saw its face. The eyes are what I remember most. Dark, intense, and unmistakably aware. They weren't animal eyes, but they weren't human either. There was an intelligence there that I still can't explain. It was observing us just as much as we were observing it. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, we stood there in this bizarre standoff. I could hear Tom's breathing getting faster beside me. My own heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst out of my chest. The creature tilted its head slightly, almost like it was studying us. That small, almost human gesture made it even more terrifying somehow. Then it made this sound. Not the deep rumble from before, but something almost like a huff or a sigh. The branches shook, and it moved with surprising speed through the canopy, heading deeper into the forest. We stood there frozen for several minutes after it disappeared. The smell lingered, but gradually the forest started to come alive again. Birds began chirping hesitantly, and a squirrel ran past us like nothing had happened. Tom was the first to speak. "We need to get out of here." His voice was shaking. I just nodded, and we practically ran back to the truck. We didn't even bother collecting our gear. Came back for it the next day with a couple of friends, making up some excuse about the chainsaw breaking down. The strange thing is, we never saw signs of it again, though we spent plenty more days cutting wood in those same woods. Sometimes I wonder if we imagined the whole thing, but then I remember those eyes, that intelligent gaze, and I know what we saw was real. For years, I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some kind of undiscovered primate, or maybe there's something out there we just don't understand yet. Tom and I didn't talk about it much after that day, not because we agreed not to, but because what was there to say? We saw what we saw. I'm sharing this now because, well, I'm getting older, and I think people should know what's out there. We weren't drunk, we weren't looking for attention, and we had nothing to gain by making this up. We were just two guys cutting wood who ran into something we couldn't explain. The thing that stays with me most isn't the size of the creature, or even its strange appearance. It's the feeling I got when it looked at us. There was something almost familiar in that gaze, like it recognized us as fellow thinking beings. That's what keeps me up at night sometimes, even now. Not fear of the creature itself, but the implications of what we saw that day. I still live in Oregon, still spend time in the woods, but I'm more aware now. Sometimes when it's too quiet, or when I catch a certain smell on the wind, I remember that day. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I know what I saw. There are things in this world we don't understand, and maybe we're better off that way. Tom passed away last winter, and that's part of why I'm finally writing this down. Someone should know what happened that day in Cedar Creek. I've never seen anything like it since, and I probably never will again. But sometimes when I'm out in the woods and that unnatural silence falls, I know I'm not alone. And I remember those eyes, watching us through the branches, belonging to something that wasn't supposed to exist. Story 20. I was 32 at the time, living in Blue Ridge, Georgia, and bird photography was my escape from my mundane office job. Every weekend, I'd head out to the woods with my camera gear. That particular day in late October started like any other: crisp mountain air, golden leaves, and the promise of catching some migrating warblers on film. I remember checking my watch at 4:15 p.m., worried about losing the light soon. I'd been out since early afternoon, perched in my usual spot near an old logging trail, waiting patiently for the evening bird activity to pick up. The light was getting that honey gold quality that photographers dream about, filtering through the canopy in these beautiful shafts. I had my Nikon F3 with a 300mm lens mounted on a tripod, and I was just adjusting my settings when I first noticed something was off. You know that feeling when the forest goes quiet? Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but that eerie silence where even the insects stop chirping. That's what happened. I initially thought maybe a bear was nearby. We get plenty of those in North Georgia, so I started scanning the tree line through my viewfinder. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. About 70 yards away, partially obscured by a massive oak tree, was this figure. I can't even call it a creature because that doesn't do justice to what I saw. It was tall, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. I'm pretty good at estimating distances and sizes from my photography work, and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. My hands started shaking so bad I had to lock my elbows against my sides to steady the camera. The being, that's the only word that feels right, was moving with this strange grace, like it knew exactly where to place each foot, despite its massive size. Its fur, and yes, it was definitely fur, not hair, was this deep chocolate brown color, but with these subtle reddish highlights where the sunlight hit it. What really got to me were its hands. I watched as it deliberately peeled bark off trees, examining something underneath, probably insects or grubs. Its fingers were long and surprisingly delicate in their movements, almost surgical in their precision. This wasn't some guy in a suit stumbling around. The muscle definition under that fur was clear as day through my lens. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, but somehow I managed to keep relatively still. I knew this was probably the only chance I'd ever get to document something like this. The smart thing would have been to run, but curiosity and fear kept me frozen in place. The most unsettling part was when it turned enough for me to see its face. I wasn't prepared for how aware it looked. Its eyes weren't animal eyes. They were deeply intelligent, almost contemplative. The face had this fascinating blend of human and non-human features that my brain still struggles to reconcile. The brow ridge was prominent, but the eyes beneath it, they looked like they understood things. Time seemed to stop existing. I just kept watching through my lens, taking photos whenever my shaking hands would allow. The being moved methodically through the area, examining fallen logs, occasionally picking up something tiny that I couldn't make out from my position. It would pause sometimes, cocking its head like it was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then came the moment that still haunts my dreams. It was investigating a rotting stump when it suddenly straightened up. No quick movements, no dramatic gestures. It just slowly turned its head and looked directly at me. Those eyes, they weren't just seeing me, they were reading me. I felt exposed, understood, and infinitely small all at once. The truly bizarre part, it didn't run, it didn't charge, it didn't make any threatening moves at all. It just regarded me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then, in a movement that seemed impossible for something so large, it simply stepped behind a thick stand of trees and vanished. No crashing through the underbrush, no sound at all, just gone. I sat there for another 30 minutes, unable to move, my hands cramped around my camera. When I finally gathered the courage to stand up, my legs were so wobbly I nearly fell over. The forest had returned to normal, birds were singing, insects buzzing, like nothing extraordinary had happened. The worst part? When I got home and developed the film, I was shooting slide film that day. Every single frame was overexposed. Whether it was my shaking hands messing up the settings or something else, I'll never know. All that potential evidence, gone. Just blank, washed-out frames. I've gone back to that spot countless times over the years, but I've never seen anything like that again. The experience changed me, though. I still photograph birds, but now I'm always watching the trees, always listening for that telling silence. Sometimes I wonder if it recognized what I was doing, if it understood I was there to document, not to harm. I've spent years trying to rationalize what I saw. I've read every scientific paper I could find about known primates, studied local wildlife reports, even joined research groups. But nothing explains what I witnessed that day. The grace of movement, the intelligence in those eyes, the complete silence of its disappearance. It all defies conventional explanation. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, sometimes I wonder if I believe it myself. But I know what I saw. Those eyes, they're burned into my memory. Whatever it was aware, intelligent, and far more graceful than anything that size should be able to be. I just hope that somewhere out there it's still roaming those woods, still peeling bark off trees with those surprisingly gentle hands, still avoiding human contact. The thing that gets me the most. Sometimes when I'm out photographing now, I'll get that prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched. And I wonder, was I the observer that day, or was I the one being observed? Story 21. It was mid-October 1995, and Jenny and I were out mushroom hunting in the woods near Maple Falls, Washington. We'd done this dozens of times before. It was kind of our thing. Jenny was visiting from Seattle for the weekend, and despite the gloomy weather forecast, we decided to risk it. The chanterelles were usually perfect this time of year, and we both loved foraging. We'd been out there for maybe 3 hours, our baskets already half full with golden chanterelles. The air was heavy with that distinctive Pacific Northwest dampness, but we'd dressed for it. Heavy boots, rain jackets, the works. Jenny had this bright red rain jacket she always wore, saying it would make it easier for search and rescue to find her if she ever got lost. We used to joke about that. After what happened, it stopped being funny. The first sign that something was off was when the birds suddenly went quiet. If you spend enough time in the woods, you know that silence isn't natural. There's always something. Birds, squirrels, the wind in the trees. But it just stopped. Jenny noticed it too. I saw her head snap up from the mushroom patch she was examining. "Mike," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you hear that?" Before I could answer, the sky darkened dramatically. I checked my watch, 2:17 p.m. Way too early for this kind of darkness. The clouds had rolled in so fast, it was like someone had thrown a blanket over the sun. The temperature dropped noticeably. I could see my breath now. That's when the rain started. Not a gradual build-up, but an instant deluge. Within seconds, we were getting drenched. "Over there!" I pointed to a rocky overhang about 50 yards away. We grabbed our baskets and ran. The overhang wasn't very deep, maybe 4 feet at most, but it was enough to keep us relatively dry. We huddled there, watching the wall of rain in front of us. The forest had taken on this weird greenish tint, and the rain was so heavy it created this sort of misty curtain that made it hard to see more than 20 feet ahead. Jenny was shivering, not from cold, but from nerves. I could tell because I'd known her since we were kids. Something felt wrong, and we both knew it. That's when we saw them. Through the curtain of rain, maybe 40 yards away, there was movement near a cave entrance I hadn't noticed before. At first, I thought it was bears. We'd seen them in the area before. But bears don't walk like that. Bears don't stand that tall. The first one that emerged was massive. I'd estimate around 9 feet tall. Its fur was a dark brown, almost black where the rain had soaked it. But it wasn't alone. Behind it came another one, slightly shorter but broader, and then a third that was noticeably smaller, maybe 6 feet tall. I grabbed Jenny's arm, probably hard enough to leave bruises, but she didn't make a sound. We both just stood there, frozen. The creatures moved with this bizarre grace that seemed impossible for their size. They took shelter under the cave's entrance, and that's when we got our clearest view of them. Their faces were almost human, but not quite. The proportions were wrong. Their foreheads sloped back, and their jaws were more pronounced. But their eyes, God, their eyes were disturbingly intelligent. The smallest one, which I assume was young, kept looking in our direction, not directly at us, but towards our hiding spot. It would tug on the fur of the larger one, pointing our way, but the adult would gently push its arm down. They weren't just animals seeking shelter. They were a family. The way they interacted, the way they communicated with each other through subtle gestures and what sounded like soft grunts. It was organized, purposeful. The largest one kept watching the rain, occasionally making these low, rumbling sounds that seemed to keep the others calm. The smallest one was fascinating. It behaved just like a curious child, trying to venture out into the rain, only to be gently pulled back by what I assume was its mother. It would pick up stones, examine them, and then show them to the others. At one point, it found what looked like an old bird's nest and spent several minutes carefully taking it apart, studying how it was constructed. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 45 minutes. Neither of us dared move. My legs were cramping from staying in the same position, but the fear of making any noise kept me still. The rain created this bubble of unreality, like we were watching something we were never meant to see. When the rain finally began to let up, the change in their behavior was immediate. The largest one made a different sound, deeper and more urgent. The family gathered closer together, and then, with a grace that still haunts me, they simply melted into the forest. There's no other way to describe it. These massive creatures just disappeared. No crashing through the underbrush, no broken branches, nothing. They vanished as silently as they had appeared. Jenny and I stayed under that overhang for another 20 minutes, neither of us speaking. When we finally felt it was safe to move, we practically ran back to my truck. We left our mushroom baskets behind. Neither of us even thought about them until we were halfway home. The drive back was silent. What do you say after something like that? It wasn't until we were back at my house, sitting at my kitchen table with untouched cups of coffee in front of us, that Jenny finally spoke. "We can't tell anyone," she said. I nodded. Who would believe us? We had no pictures. Our phones were in my truck, and even if we'd had them, the rain was too heavy for clear photos. All we had was what we saw, and the absolute certainty that the official stance on these creatures being myths was wrong. Jenny and I made a pact that day to keep it to ourselves. She moved to Oregon a few years later, but we still talk regularly. We never discuss it directly, but sometimes during our calls, there's a pause in the conversation, and I know we're both thinking about that rainy afternoon in Maple Falls. I've been back to those woods many times since then, always hoping and dreading that I might see them again. I never have. The cave is still there, but it's just a cave now. Sometimes I wonder if the rain and darkness played tricks on our minds, but then I remember the intelligence in their eyes, the way they moved, the family dynamics we witnessed, and I know what we saw was real. I'm sharing this now because I recently heard about similar sightings in the area. I want anyone who's had a similar experience to know they're not crazy. These creatures exist. They're out there, living their lives parallel to ours, rarely seen but very real. And they're not the monsters people make them out to be. They're families, like us, just trying to survive in a world that's increasingly encroaching on their territory. That day changed how I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that defy our neat scientific categories, and maybe that's okay. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, just witnessed and remembered. Looking back, I feel privileged to have seen them, despite the fear and uncertainty of that moment. They weren't hostile or aggressive. They were just sheltering from the rain, just like us. The young one's curiosity, the parents' protectiveness, these were behaviors we could understand, even relate to. It makes me wonder how many other times they've watched us, hidden in the shadows of their forest home. I still go mushroom hunting, but never when rain is forecasted. Some experiences don't need to be repeated. They just need to be remembered and finally shared. Story 22. That autumn morning started like any other day checking my equipment. I had 5 camera setups scattered across a remote area of forest where I'd been tracking deer and bear movements. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear, with just enough moisture in the air to keep the ground soft for tracking. I remember checking my watch as I parked my truck at the trailhead, 6:45 a.m. The sun was just starting to filter through the trees. The first warning sign came when I approached my closest camera location. Usually you'd hear the normal forest sounds, birds, small animals rustling in the undergrowth. But there was this absence of sound. You know that feeling when you walk into a room and can tell someone's been there, even though you can't see them. It was like that, but amplified by the vastness of the forest. As I got closer to where my first camera was supposed to be, my stomach dropped. The setup was completely dismantled, and when I say dismantled, I don't mean smashed or torn apart like a bear might do. The camera was methodically taken apart, the lens separated from the body, the film carefully removed, and even the batteries taken out. Everything was laid out on a fallen log, arranged in a way that made my skin crawl. It looked like someone had disassembled it to figure out how it worked. My hands were shaking as I picked up the pieces. The strange thing was, there were these massive fingerprints on the lens. Not smudges, actual distinct fingerprints, but they were huge. And the way the components were handled, there wasn't a single scratch on any of them. Whatever did this had the dexterity and patience to handle delicate equipment. I've dealt with vandals before, but this was different. No teenager would take the time to carefully dismantle a camera like this. And those fingerprints, they were at least twice the size of a human hand. That's when I noticed the hair. Caught on a low-hanging branch near the camera setup were several thick, dark strands. They were about 6 inches long, coarse, and unlike anything I'd seen on local wildlife. I put a few strands in my pocket, trying to keep my hands steady. I decided to check the second camera location, about a quarter-mile away. As I walked, I started hearing it. A rhythmic wooden knocking sound, like someone hitting a hollow tree with a stick. But it wasn't coming from just one direction. The sounds seemed to move, coming from different spots in the forest. First from my left, then behind me, then off to my right. It was like whatever was making the sound was coordinating, communicating. The second camera was in the same state as the first, meticulously dismantled, and the third, and the fourth. Each site had the same massive fingerprints, the same careful arrangement of parts. By this point, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely think straight. I'd been doing wildlife photography for over a decade, and I'd never seen anything like this. At the fifth and final camera location, everything changed. As I approached, I heard movement, heavy movement, the sound of branches breaking under significant weight. I froze. About 50 yards ahead, through a gap in the trees, I saw it. The figure was massive, at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair. It wasn't just big, it moved with purpose. The way it navigated between the trees showed intelligence, awareness. It was deliberately keeping trees between itself and where my cameras had been positioned. What hit me hardest wasn't the size or appearance. It was the deliberate nature of its movements. This wasn't some animal randomly wandering through the woods. It knew exactly what it was doing. It understood what my cameras were for and had systematically disabled them all. I stood there, paralyzed, as it moved behind a large oak tree and seemingly vanished. The forest fell completely silent again, except for that knocking sound, which had become more intense, more urgent. It was coming from at least 3 different directions now, maybe more. That's when I felt it. Eyes on me. Not just from one direction, but from several. The feeling was overwhelming, like being surrounded by invisible watchers. My training as a photographer had taught me to trust my instincts about animal behavior, and every instinct was screaming that I was being observed, studied, just as I had been studying the wildlife in these woods. I started backing away slowly, trying to remember my wilderness training. No sudden movements, no running, but every fiber of my being wanted to sprint back to my truck. The knocking sounds followed me, keeping pace on either side as I made my way out. They seemed to be coordinating, maintaining a perimeter around me. Just before I got back to the trail leading to my truck, I heard a deep, resonant sound that I still can't properly describe, somewhere between a growl and a hum, but with an intelligence behind it that made my blood run cold. It came from directly behind me, and it took everything I had not to break into a run. I made it back to my truck and drove straight to the local ranger station. The ranger on duty could see how shaken I was and took my report seriously. When we went back the next day with a small team, all we found were my dismantled cameras, still laid out in their precise arrangements. The hair I'd collected was sent for analysis, but the results came back inconclusive. The lab said the samples didn't match any known wildlife in the region. I never set up cameras in that part of the forest again. In fact, I switched to mainly shooting landscapes after that. Some people suggested I should go back, try to get proof of what I saw. But whatever was out there had made its point clear. It didn't want to be photographed, and it was smart enough to ensure it wouldn't be. The thing that still haunts me most isn't the size of what I saw, or even those massive fingerprints. It's the intelligence behind it all. The methodical way the cameras were dismantled, the coordinated knocking sounds, the deliberate way it avoided being photographed. Whatever I encountered that day wasn't just some undiscovered animal. It understood what cameras were, what they did, and how to disable them without destroying them. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened. Was it some elaborate prank, a group of people coordinating to scare me? But that doesn't explain the size of those fingerprints or the hair samples or the way that figure moved through the forest. And why go to the trouble of carefully dismantling the cameras rather than just destroying them or stealing them? Sometimes when I'm out shooting landscapes, I still hear those knocking sounds in the distance. It might just be my imagination, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever I encountered that day is still out there, still watching, still making sure it doesn't end up on film. I've never gone public with this story before because, honestly, who would believe it? But I know what I saw, what I experienced. And I know that there are things in our forests that are far more intelligent and aware than we give them credit for. Things that understand us better than we understand them. Those cameras might not have captured any images that day, but what I experienced left an impression that no photograph could ever truly capture. Some things, I've learned, prefer to remain undocumented, and maybe we should respect that choice. Story 23. It was late summer of 1993, and I was doing what I'd done every August since moving to Maine, picking wild blueberries. I owned a small catering business back then, and my homemade blueberry pies were pretty famous locally. That year, my usual spot had been picked clean by birds, so I ventured deeper into the woods near Crystal River, about a mile off Thompson Road. The morning started normally enough. It was one of those perfect Maine summer days, not too hot, maybe mid-70s, with this gentle breeze carrying that sweet pine scent through the air. I'd packed my usual gear, 2 large buckets, water, some sandwiches, and my old Walkman. I remember having Paula Abdul's Forever Your Girl album playing that morning. Yeah, I know, dating myself here. I'd been picking for maybe 2 hours when something started feeling off. You know that feeling when you're alone but suddenly feel like you're being watched? It was like that, but way more intense. At first I tried to shake it off. I mean, I'd been in these woods hundreds of times before. But then I noticed something weird about the blueberry bushes about 20 feet ahead of me. They were stripped, not destroyed or trampled like when bears get to them, but methodically picked, like someone had carefully gone through each branch and taken every ripe berry. The weird part was the height. Some of these bushes were pretty tall, maybe 7 feet, and they were picked clean right to the top. No ladder marks or anything around them. I remember thinking maybe some other pickers had been there, but something wasn't adding up. The branches had these strange marks on them, like someone with huge hands had held them while picking. And when I say huge, I mean huge. The indentations in the bark were like nothing I'd ever seen before. That's when I noticed the path. If you've ever been in Maine woods, you know how thick the underbrush can get. but there was this clear trail where the vegetation had been pushed down, like something big had walked through. Not crashed through like a moose would do, but deliberately stepped through, pressing down the plants rather than breaking them. My curiosity got the better of my growing unease. I followed the trail, still holding my half-full bucket of berries. The path led to this clearing I'd never noticed before, maybe about 50 yards from where I'd been picking. What I found there still gives me nightmares. In the middle of the clearing was what I can only describe as a nest. Not like a bird's nest. This thing was huge, maybe 8 feet across. It was made of branches and leaves woven together in this weirdly intricate way. Some of the branches used were thick, the kind that would take significant strength to bend and weave. And the smell. God, the smell. It was this powerful, musky odor, like wet dog mixed with something else I can't even describe. It made my eyes water. Around the nest were piles of half-eaten berries and other fruits. Some looked fresh, others were starting to rot. There were also some weird patterns pressed into the ground, like massive footprints, but they were partially obscured by leaves and debris. I still remember the size of one clear print. My entire hand spread out wouldn't cover even half of it. I was so focused on examining the nest that I almost missed the movement at first. It was just a slight shifting in my peripheral vision. But when I looked up, my whole world stopped. About 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a large pine, was someone. I don't even know how to describe it. It was tall, so tall. I'm 5'8", and this thing had to be at least 8 feet high, maybe more. It was covered in dark, reddish-brown hair, not like fur, more like long human hair, but everywhere. The face. I only saw it for a few seconds, but it was both human-like and completely alien at the same time. The eyes were what got me. They were dark, but so intelligent. There was something so aware in that gaze, something that spoke of consciousness and curiosity. We just stared at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I couldn't do anything but stand there, my bucket of berries frozen halfway to my chest. It was perfectly still, too, just watching me. The strangest part? I wasn't terrified. I mean, I was scared, sure, but not in the way you'd expect. It was more like the fear you feel when you encounter something you can't explain, something that shouldn't exist, but clearly does. Then it moved. Not towards me, thank God, but sideways, still partially hidden by the trees. Its movement was so smooth, so deliberate. Not at all like the clumsy walk you'd expect from something that size. As it moved, branches cracked under its weight, the only sound in what felt like a completely silent forest. I don't remember dropping my bucket, but I must have, because the next thing I knew I was running. I've never run so fast in my life. I could hear movement behind me, branches breaking, but I didn't look back. I just ran and ran until I reached my car. I fumbled with my keys so badly I dropped them twice before finally getting the door open. When I finally got home, I was covered in scratches from running through the brush, and my clothes were soaked with sweat. I sat in my kitchen for hours, just staring at nothing, trying to process what I'd seen. I called in sick to work the next day. Actually called in sick for the whole week. I couldn't sleep. Kept seeing those eyes in my mind. I never reported it. Who would believe me? A middle-aged baker claiming she saw Bigfoot while picking blueberries. I'd be the laughingstock of Crystal River. But I did go back about a week later with my husband. The clearing was still there, but the nest was gone. The only evidence anything had been there at all was the lingering smell and some unusually bent branches. I've spent the last 3 decades trying to rationalize what I saw that day. Maybe it was a bear standing unusually straight. Maybe it was some kind of mass hallucination brought on by heat and exhaustion. Maybe I imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those eyes. They were too aware, too intelligent to be anything but real. I still live in Maine, still run my catering business, though it's mostly my daughter's now, and still make my blueberry pies. But I buy my berries from local farms these days. I haven't been back to those woods since that last time with my husband. Some things change you forever, you know. Some experiences just remake your whole world, and you can never go back to seeing things the way you did before. I'm sharing this now because, well, I guess because I'm tired of keeping it to myself. I don't need anyone to believe me. I know what I saw, but sometimes I wonder about that creature. Was it as surprised to see me as I was to see it? Did it feel that same moment of connection I felt when our eyes met? And most of all, is it still out there, quietly picking berries in the Maine woods, leaving nothing but carefully stripped bushes and woven nests as evidence of its passage? I still get goosebumps every August when the blueberries are ripe. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I catch a whiff of something musky on the breeze, and for a split second, I'm right back there in that clearing, staring into those eyes that shouldn't exist, but do.